Welcome back to Western Religions. This is a video series to accompany a semester-long survey of Western religions class, specifically to accompany the Oxford University Press World Religions, Western Traditions 5th edition textbook. We're going to divide this chapter into 10 sections. One is ancient religious terminology. Then we're going to look at prehistorical religions. Then an extended treatment of the common features of ancient religions, kind of giving you a survey and comparing and contrasting their main traits. Then we'll look at a bit more detail at some of the main ancient Western religions. Mesopotamian religions, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Iranian, mainly Zoroastrianism, and Manichaeanism. And finally, a brief look at the end of paganism in the West. Section 2.1, Ancient Religious Terminology. We're going to begin with a little bit of terminology. The English word religion comes from the Latin word religio, which can be interpreted as binding back together. It connotes a sense of obligation within a relationship, specifically the bond between humans and the gods they worship. There's also the Latin word traditio, or the origin of the English word tradition. This connotes a ritual or custom that preserves practices and obligations of past generations. The term world religion generally means a religion that you can find not just in one culture, but in many different cultures. These are often missionary religions that deliberately try to spread themselves, like Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism. Western religion as a term is useful, but it is a bit ambiguous. It's generally used to include Judaism, Christianity, and Islam at a minimum. So to begin with, we can look at the Fertile Crescent, which is the origin of civilization in the West. And by the West, we basically mean the Middle East, Mediterranean. The Fertile Crescent is a crescent-shaped swath of land from the mountains of western Iran to northern Mesopotamia, including the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, to southeastern Anatolia and the Levant. Agriculture began in the highlands of the Fertile Crescent and then spread both east and west. It was also invented independently in other parts of the world as well. The term ancient Near East refers to the early history of the Near East or Middle East, starting at the Bronze Age, so around 3000 BC and after. So this is several thousand years after farming had been invented. Religions such as Judaism and Christianity spread outward from the ancient Near East. The term religions of antiquity can be used to refer to pre-Christian or pre-Muslim religions of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. The Latin word antiquitas was a term used by Christians in the 4th century AD, mainly to disparage the older Greco-Roman religion, but we get our word antiquity from it. They also use the word pagan, which means of the countryside in Latin, and it suggests uneducated, unsophisticated religious belief. There's also the Arabic term jahiliyyah, which is used by Muslims to describe non-Muslims, and it connotes barbarian ignorance. So you can see that we have a variety of words to describe these historical or ancient Western religions, but some of them have various connotations. There's also the term religions of the book, which comes from Islam. It can be used as a term for Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all of which are scriptural religions. Other ancient scriptural religions included Zoroastrianism and Manichaeanism. Now, there were other ancient religions that used scriptures, but they weren't all primarily based on them. Now let's look at some of the views of religion from some of these ancient Western cultures. In Mesopotamia, which is the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, corresponding to modern Iraq, they had the phrase fear of God, and they used this to refer to reverence for the gods manifested in cultic or ritual observances. An early word for prayer was written with the cuneiform sign for grain. inside the sign for calf. And this connotes sacrifice or offerings to the gods. That was a basic part of their religion. Cuneiform is the ancient writing of Mesopotamia. Pious and wise people prayed to and sacrificed to the gods in the belief of the ancient Mesopotamians. The gods were thought of as valuing truth and as never deceiving. Faith in the gods' truthfulness and reciprocity, honoring contracts, all of these were part of their view of religion. The Egyptian view of religion was often focused on death and the dead, or really the desire to have an afterlife. In the famous text known as the Book of the Dead from the 13th century BC, the quote comes, quote, "Propitiate the gods with the breath of their mouths, give proper offerings to the gods, and render supplication offerings to the dead," end quote. Egyptian religion also evolved a highly ethical notion. It emphasized ma'at, or righteousness, which include treating other humans justly, and truth. Religion included not lying and detesting falsehood. The Greek view of religion is expressed by a few different terms. Ta hosion usually meant public expressions of piety, whereas eusebia, or piety as is often translated, could connote a privately felt reverence. There was also a Greek phrase that's translated as honoring the gods by participating in traditional practices. And this had a similar meaning to the Latin word religio used by the Romans. Euthyphro is a character in Plato's dialogue of the same name, but he's probably based on a historical priest who lived in Athens in the 4th century BC. And Euthyphro defines Eusebia as human care for the gods, pleasing gods in word and deed through prayer and sacrifice. Even though Plato, in the character of Socrates, goes on to criticize Euthyphro's attempt to define piety this way, it probably represents a common view in ancient Greece. The Roman view of religion is related to the word religio, which we get the word religion from. There are actually two different senses or ways of interpreting this word. Uh, One interpretation is regarding the word as coming from the Latin word religare, which means to bind or bind back together, and this suggests a bond between humans and the gods. The other interpretation looks at the word as related to religere, to go over again, and this would imply a repetition of a sacred ritual. There was also the Latin phrase pax deorum, peace or harmony with the gods or of the gods. And this is the idea of receiving support from the gods by adhering to ancestral customs, thus basically keeping a peaceful or harmonious relationship with them. Cicero, the ancient Roman writer, orator, philosopher, he had an interesting view of religion. He used the phrase pious cult of the gods to refer to Roman religion. This Roman religion included much local variation, as was typical with most ancient customary religions. Cult could refer to ritual worship and piety, giving the gods their due. Both of these were part of Cicero's notion of religion. And in general, he divided ancient Roman religion into three main parts. Number one, rites, which includes rituals or cult. This is the proper way of worshiping the gods and ceremony. The second is auspices, or methods for divination. And there are various methods used by the Romans. Augury is usually associated with examining the flight of birds and trying to find meaning in it. Haruspicy is based on examining the entrails or organs of sacrificed animals. And then the third main part of religion was prophecies. These would be collections of omens, such as the Sibylline books, which were omens from the Sibyl, a famous female prophet. Epictetus was an ancient Stoic philosopher who was in the time of the Roman Empire. There's a quote from Epictetus about religion. Quote, In piety towards the gods, the chief element is to have right opinions about them, as existing and administering the universe well and justly, and to have set yourself to obey them and to submit to everything that happens and to follow it voluntarily, in the belief that it's being fulfilled by the highest intelligence. End quote. So this is a very philosophical and ethical view of religion that would have been somewhat different from the more ancient or customary view in ancient Roman and Greek culture, which is where Stoic philosophy originates. But many philosophers, they didn't necessarily believe in all the traditional myths or stories about their gods, or advocate worshiping them with all the usual customs and ceremonies, but they thought of the gods as being inherently wise and just, and as governing the universe in that fashion, and that being part of the important or philosophical aspect of religious belief. So there's even debate among scholars about how important belief was in these ancient religions. Note that Cicero's definitions of religions don't actually include belief or specify believing the right things about the gods. Some scholars have gone so far as to suggest that ancient religion had no role for religious belief, only for practice. This is similar to the Japanese religion Shinto, which has rules for how to honor the kami or the gods in shrines, but no official theology or theory of the gods that followers of Shinto or worshippers of the kami are supposed to accept. But on the other hand, ancients did believe in the gods and in the efficacy of religious rituals. So even just to make sense of the practice, it probably makes sense to presuppose certain beliefs. You could say that their beliefs were expressed through their practice. However, it's true that ancient religions generally lacked an orthodox theology. There was no official party line, so to speak, you had to follow. There was a lot of local variation, and the religion was something that wasn't really rationally defended or articulated so much as just a set of customs inherited from the ancestors and transmitted on to the next generation. And in that regard, it resembles other customary religions, including ones like Shinto. Section 2.2, Prehistory. So we do have some archaeological evidence of ritual and symbol in prehistoric humans. Modern humans emerged somewhere around 200,000 years ago, give or take. These would be anatomically modern humans. And the use of red ochre, a natural pigment in burials, is almost as old as humans. So for example, 100,000 years ago, there was an infant burial in a cave in South Africa with red ochre and pierced shell pendants. And the use of red ochre is usually interpreted as ritual or ceremonial. There are also cave paintings in Europe, all the way from the Iberian Peninsula in the far west, Spain, to the Ural Mountains in the far east, in what's now Russia. And these paintings were created over a period of tens of thousands of years, from around 35,000 to 10,000 BC. Many of them probably had religious significance, such as paintings of large game that might be expected to increase the success of a hunt. This is kind of paralleling some practices of later cultures that have rituals they perform to try to guarantee the success of a hunt. There are also shrines in the northwestern part of the Fertile Crescent, dating from around 13,000 to 5,000 BC, and these include the oldest stone monumental architecture humans have created. The oldest ones were from the transition period between hunting and foraging to early farming. The shrines have symbolism like female figurines and burials. The example shown in the slide is the famous one of the oldest female figurines, the Venus of Willendorf, which is dated to around 25 to 30,000 years before present, or BP. Göbekli Tepe is a really famous Neolithic site in northern Mesopotamia, what's now southeastern Turkey. It dates from around 9500 to 8000 BC. So this is the earliest megalith or large stone structure. The megaliths at Göbekli Tepe are in concentric stone circles. They include benches and T-shaped pillars with sides that resemble arms, and these are thought to have religious or ritual importance. And this particular site is the oldest known example of human monumental stone architecture. And some scholars say that it was built even before farming was developed. But there was also a kind of long transition period where, like, wild growing wheat, for example, would be gathered. And there's kind of like a gradual move to farming. The pre-agricultural foragers who built Göbekli Tepe probably used it as a meeting site for feasts and ceremonies. The oldest evidence of wheat domestication dates to around 9000 BC, and it's only 20 miles from the location of Göbekli Tepe, so it makes sense if the two were related. Agriculture may even have developed to help feed the people who gathered there. So, in other words, it's not known, but it's possible that this religious site may have been the cause of agriculture and thus eventually civilization. Çatalhöyük is another really important Neolithic site with religious significance. It's an early agricultural town in central Anatolia. It was inhabited from around 7400 to 6000 BC. There are two main zones at the site, one of normal houses and two of an apparently sacred area. In the sacred area, there are platforms built over burial sites. There are painted walls with humans baiting animals and humans with bulls' heads. There are plaster-covered bulls' skulls, and all of this is painted with red ochre. The houses have burials in them, and some of the burials have their heads removed, typically 1 year after death. The archaeologists can actually determine that. And the skulls were periodically plastered and painted with red ochre, probably as a memorial to their ancestors. There's also a figurine of a seated large-breasted woman giving birth, flanked by two leopards. So if we compare Çatalhöyük to other ancient sites, we see similar female figurines throughout the Fertile Crescent, the earliest from the 9000s BC. Bulls are common imagery as well. Bulls were the primary sacrificial animal of the ancient Mediterranean, and bull gods were common, such as the god El from Canaan, or Apis. Uh, Çayırnu is a site near Çatalhöyük, and in that site there's a burial of 450 bodies with dozens of bull skulls. Nabta Playa is also a very interesting Neolithic site in the western desert of southern Egypt. It was a meeting place for Saharan cattle herders, and it dates from the late 7th to the mid 4th millennium BC. The Valley of Sacrifices has burials, cattle remains, and a life-size sculpture of a cow, which could be connected to the later Egyptian goddess of cows. The megalithic complexes include standing stones that have anthropomorphic or human-shaped shoulders oriented towards the brightest stars. There's the calendar circle, which has standing stones used to predict the summer solstice or start of the rainy season. We often see that with Neolithic religion, that it's oriented around the cycles of the seasons, which makes sense for cultures that depended for their food on farming and herding and such like. If we compare Nabta Playa to ancient Egypt, it seems related to ancient Egyptian civilization. So Hathor is the cow goddess, the patron deity of rulers, and there's similar imagery at the Nabta Playa site. The pyramids had internal passages oriented to the same stars as the megaliths of Nabta Playa. Gods were regarded as living in those stars. So there are probably astrological traditions starting in the Neolithic period that continue into later period of antiquity. And the astrology is often connected to the belief in gods and spirits that inhabit or just associated with those stars. Section 2.3, Common Features of Ancient Religions. So we're going to divide this one into 4 subsections: deities, myths, worship, and afterlife. First, we're going to start with deities or gods. So, gods in polytheistic religions are often personifications, giving human form to natural or social phenomena. There are two main types of depictions of gods, anthropomorphic and theriomorphic. Anthropomorphic means human-like in appearance, social relationships, or social roles. And theriomorphic means animal form or traits. And sometimes these are combined, as with ancient Egyptian gods. You also often see rituals to gods that have metaphor, analogy, and homophony. Metaphor is referring to one thing by mentioning another, or using one thing to symbolize or represent another. Analogy is a comparison between two things for the purpose of clarification or explanation. And homophony is different words that sound similar. So often these will crop up as kind of recurring themes if you look at the details of rituals. Many myths also have competing explanations of the same natural or social phenomena. This is not unusual in ancient religions. They tend to have diversity over time and between different locales, and they didn't usually have a systematically developed official or orthodox theology or other belief system. You can see in the picture of the Egyptian god Ra sending rays of light as a blessing to a lady devotee. And you can look at the symbolism in this in various ways, but light itself can be a symbol for various types of illumination, wisdom, even healing. So the word God is related in meaning to words like deity and divinity. It's a supernatural being who has power over nature or human society, and generally who can interact with humans. There's often no actual official number of gods, or rather, a culture may say a certain number, but the number is more symbolic. These cultures were polytheistic. They worshiped many gods and spirits, and so they're basically countless or very numerous. In Egyptian religion, there's over 1,500 named deities. In ancient Sumerian religion, Sumeria was the earliest Mesopotamian culture. They officially reckon 3,600 gods, but that's a symbolic number because 360 is a number of wholeness. They divided the year into 360 days, and that's also where we get the 360 degrees of a circle from. It's from ancient Sumerian culture. In Babylon, they said that there were 300 gods from on high and 300 gods from below. So it is often common to classify gods under different types like this. In ancient Greek religion, they had many gods, 12 Olympians, which are kind of like the major or the most popular or most commonly worshipped gods. But there were many dozens, if not hundreds, of additional named gods as well. The ancient Greek philosopher Thales from the 6th century BC said the world was full of gods, although the exact interpretation of that might be a little bit unclear. But he was probably thinking of things like in the example of the magnet, where magnets can move each other apparently without any normal physical mechanism. Thales and others would look at that as evidence of the presence of gods or spirits. So different philosophers, though, had different views on that. And in Roman religion, they worshipped big gods like the Greek Olympians, but they had many little gods and spirits, including of the household, the hearth, etc. So divinity you can also look at as a continuum from bigger, more powerful, grander gods to more limited local gods. So there might be one supreme god who's ruling over everything, but in ancient religion, the supreme god is often very distant. The great gods would be gods like the Olympians, the ones that you would normally worship. And they would have authority over large swaths of nature and society, like love or war or fertility or death or kingship. Secondary gods, minor gods, demigods in Greek thought were half human, half divine. Hercules or Heracles in Greek being the most famous example, who was a son of Zeus. And heroes were often worshipped as gods or godlike beings as well. There could be personified abstractions, There could be nature spirits, such as spirits of trees or springs, spirits of the dead, and divinized emperors, at least in later Roman and other religions. Early gods were often just straight personifications of natural phenomena or social phenomena. So the natural phenomena you often see associated with gods are the sun, the moon, planets, sky, grain, fresh water, salt water, and storms. The distinction between fresh water and salt water was often very important for ancient myth and religion. Social and political phenomena that were often associated with gods include father, mother, king, queen, maiden, war, and farming. Zeus, for example, was the god of storms and thunder. The word pantheon in Greek means all the gods. So most of these religions had a group of gods, a pantheon, that all members of the religion would worship. They would generally go to different gods based on their need. Some of them would be especially devoted to one god. Priests would often specialize in worshiping one or a set number of gods more than others. But they weren't really exclusive, and that's also connected to why it was usually easy for them to borrow gods from other cultures too, to just add to their list. There were also often gods associated with a city as its patron and protector, and that god might have its own spouse and counselors, paralleling the social roles of the rulers of that city, the human rulers. Sometimes when the city would rise in power and become dominant within the culture, then the patron deity would rise along with it and maybe later be regarded as the king of the gods of that culture. An example of an ancient Greek city god would be Athena, who was the goddess of the city of Athens. Another example is Marduk, who is the patron deity of Babylon. When Babylon became an empire, he became regarded as the king of all the gods. Another example is Amun, the Egyptian patron deity of the city of Thebes. He was later linked with the sun god Ra as Amun Ra. The gods are generally associated with power. The Akkadian word Ilum, meaning God, is from an Akkadian word for power. It's related to the Hebrew word El, which is also used in the Hebrew Bible to refer to God, and Allah in Arabic, and those both derive from the word Ilum. These are all Semitic languages, so they were related to each other. The greatest power was often associated with storms, so it's common to see storm gods placed over the others as kings. For example, the ancient Mesopotamian god Enlil or the Greek god Zeus, both gods of storms and kings of the gods. Secondary gods could act as advisors and judges for the main or ruling gods. And minor gods would often act as servants, and there's a blurry line between minor gods and spirits. In ancient Greek, the word daimon meant spirit. The English word demon comes from it, but the daimones were not all evil. Most of them weren't evil, although some of them could act as agents of punishment of the gods, but they were doing divine justice, essentially. The Greeks had a separate word for evil spirit, which was kakodaimon. The hierarchy of the gods, from the king to the lowest, upheld the order of the cosmos, and it was kind of a social parallel to the human hierarchies in their cultures. Divine light was also associated with the gods. The Mesopotamians used the word melamu to mean luminous power. In ancient Egyptian, the word aku meant radiant power. The Greek word theos for God originally meant bright or shining. A Roman example is the poet Ovid in his Fasti, says that the earth gleamed with a purple light when the narrator prays to Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth. You can see in the picture on the right in the tablet of the sun god Shamash, who was an ancient Middle Eastern deity of the sun, that there's rays of light coming from the solar disk. And so for Shamash, those rays were symbolic of his power. The gods were generally thought of as omniscient or at least possessing additional knowledge that humans didn't have, superhuman knowledge. The word omniscient, though, literally means all knowing. So these are some of the kinds of knowledge ascribed to the gods: knowledge of human minds and their actions, including those done in secret, knowledge of the cosmos or nature and its inner workings, and knowledge of the future. This knowledge could be given to diviners and oracles, like the Pythian oracle of Apollo, the ancient Greek town of Delphi. Gods were also regarded as immortal, not dying. Some gods did die, but generally because they were killed by other gods, by violence, not from old age. And even gods that died would often live on in the underworld or in some diminished form, like a deceased human would. There are appropriations of gods into different cultures. This was fairly common. Sometimes the gods might not be worshipped in another culture, but gods from one culture might be associated with gods from another. In the ancient Sumerian god lists, the earliest form of these were just lists of the gods with two columns, one column with the name of each god and the other column with their description. But later on, they developed bilingual god lists as Sumerian cultures, which were the oldest cultures of Mesopotamia, came into contact with various Semitic cultures, such as Babylon. So here's an example of some equivalences between Sumerian gods on the one hand and Semitic gods on the other. The Sumerian goddess Inanna was associated with the Semitic goddess Ishtar, both fertility goddesses. The Sumerian Utu was associated with the Semitic Shamash, both sun gods. The Sumerian Enki was associated with the Semitic Ea, who is a god of water and wisdom. And later still there were multilingual god lists with names of the same god in multiple languages. There also was syncretism, especially in later antiquity. Syncretism means combining elements of different religions. There are some examples between Greece and Persia after Alexander the Great had conquered the Persian Empire, and just from the general interactions between the two cultures. An example is the king Artaxerxes II, who erected a statue to Aphrodite Anaitis, and that was combining the Greek goddess Aphrodite with the Persian goddess Anaitis. And then this was perpetuated by Alexander the Great and the various Greek or Hellenistic dynasties that ruled over Persia and other parts of the Middle East that succeeded him. Another example is Heracles Artagones, a Greco-Persian syncretic deity. And there were Greek and Babylonian correlations in later antiquity. For example, the Greek god Zeus was correlated with the Babylonian god Marduk. The Greek goddess Aphrodite was correlated with the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. Some of these correlations were important for astrology because ancient Babylonian astrology associated each planet and star with a god, and especially the planets became incorporated into Greek and Roman culture, but they were given different names by those other cultures. There were also Greek-Egyptian correlations. The Greek god Zeus was correlated with the Egyptian god Amun, the Greek goddess Demeter with the Egyptian goddess Isis, both goddesses of fertility and grain in the case of Demeter. And the Greek god Hermes was kind of the messenger of the gods and a guide for souls, was equated with the Egyptian god Thoth, the god of scribes. And later on, this god was worshipped as Hermes Trismegistus. Trismegistus, or thrice great, was a title or epithet of Thoth. And this figure became important, especially in later Western alchemy and occult, including the Hermetic tradition, named after this syncretic god. So there are various types of gods. There could be gods of the household, in Roman religion, lares or penates. There could be gods of the countryside, such as Pan, the god of wild places from ancient Greek religion. There's the Latin term genius loci for a spirit of place, but many cultures had a similar concept. There'd be spirits living in trees, in mountains, in rivers, and things of that nature, just all around. There could be city gods, mainly patron gods of a city. Apollo was the patron of the city of Miletus. Marduk was the patron god of Babylon. And there could be gods of a state or kingdom. Amun-Ra was the patron god, you might say, of New Kingdom Egypt. This was an association of Amun with the sun god Ra. Goddesses and women often played a big role in ancient religions. So, a few Egyptian examples. Isis was a nurturing mother. She was often shown nursing the infant Horus. Hathor was the goddess of beauty, love, and motherhood. She was depicted as a cow or as a woman wearing a crown with a sun disk between cow horns. She was associated with Sekhmet, a lion-headed goddess of violent destruction. And Tawaret was a child-nourishing goddess depicted as a hippopotamus. So you can see many of the goddesses were associated with fertility, childbirth, love, motherhood, but they also could be associated with destruction. Mesopotamian examples of goddesses include Inanna-Ishtar, the goddess of love and war and sustained kingship. Ninsun, the mistress of wild cows. This was the mother of the famous Mesopotamian king Gilgamesh. And Ninhursag was the wet nurse of kings. So she was kind of a queen mother associated with kingship. Some Greek examples include Hera, wife of Zeus, so she was queen of the gods, guardian of women. She was depicted as a cow. Asclepius, the god of medicine, was male, but he helped women in fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth. Strabo, the Greek geographer, said, quote, "All agree that women are the chief founders of religion. It's women who encourage men to more attentive worship of the gods." End quote. Part 2. Myths. A myth is a story involving gods and heroes that features the supernatural, and it often focuses on the underlying meaning of what it's trying to explain, usually some natural or social phenomena. But there are various functions of myths: to explain phenomena such as the world, human nature, society, or politics, entertain, moralize, legitimize, inspire, or mock, and to give meaning and purpose to what it's trying to explain. Mythic explanation can be contrasted with rational explanations given by philosophers or scientists. There's often a contrast made between myth or mythos in Greek and a rational explanation or theory, which would have been called logos in ancient Greek. There are several different types of myths. Cosmogonies are histories of the world. Cosmologies say something about the structure of the world. Theogonies are stories of the origin or generations of the gods. Theologies are theories of the nature of the gods. Anthropogonies talk about the origin of humanity, whereas an anthropology would give a story that explains the nature of humans. There could be myths that talk about fate and free will as themes. Theodicies or attempts to explain the actual goodness or providential governance of the universe despite the presence of evil. And then eschatologies or myths that talk about the end of the universe or what happens in the afterlife of an individual person. In the picture on the right, we see the Greek god Zeus attacking Typhon, who could be interpreted as a symbol of chaos and disorder. Oftentimes there are stories associated with the creation or early history of the world where the king of the gods has to do battle against some force of chaos or disorder. A cosmogony is a story or theory of the origin of the world. Creation in antiquity was often thought of not as ex nihilo or from nothing, but rather as a transformation of a pre-existing but shapeless chaos. The Greek word chaos means empty space, void, gap, or abyss. but even when that is used in Greek myths, it's thought of as pre-existing the cosmos. Some thought of the chaos as undifferentiated waters, a mix of salt water and fresh water. Among other things, this would make human survival problematic because humans need fresh water to drink to survive. The chaos could also be thought of as a fluid mixture of all the elements, and often when a god or the gods bring order to chaos, part of that order is separating the salt waters from the fresh waters, or separating the mixed elements into orderly distinctions. In the Jewish tradition, God's destruction of the beast Leviathan is often interpreted as the Jewish version of these myths of bringing order from the chaos. There also were natural analogies with cosmogonies. So if you look at the daily cycle of the sun, the annual cycle of seasons, they're often associated with some of these myths of the creation or the beginning. Example from ancient Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile was probably the most important event. The flooding enabled fields to be irrigated, but could also be destructive. So this is associated with the creation story that involves an earthen mound, a lotus plant, and primeval waters that recede like the receding waters of the flooding Nile. The dung beetle was an important symbol because it lays its eggs in dung. It was a symbol of self-creation in Egyptian religion. Cosmogonies could also involve human analogies, and we get several versions of this in ancient Egyptian religion. It was actually fairly common for ancient religions from one culture to have multiple cosmogonies. These reflect the variation we see in general in these religions. They could have been developed at different times or in different places within the larger culture. So one cosmogony from ancient Egypt has the god Atum, whose name means non-existent or completed, ejaculated into his hand, simulating sex, but with himself. But because he was a god, he was able to impregnate himself thereby, and gave birth to twins, the god Shu, god of air, and the goddess Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, also called Ankh, life, and Ma'at, order, respectively. So Atum passed his Ka, or life force, to his offspring, and they gave it in turn to their children Geb, earth, and Nut, sky. Geb and Nut sired brothers Osiris and Set, and the sisters and their consorts Isis and Nephthys. Now Set murdered Osiris, but his wife Isis was able to temporarily revive him enough for her to procreate with him and give birth to their son Horus, who continued the struggle against the evil god or the destructive god Set. The second cosmogony from ancient Egypt involved Atum differentiating into Ra, the sun god, Heka, which is magical power, Sia, imagination, and Hu, word. The creator is thus, quote, the one who made himself into millions, unquote. Both of these stories involve the creator god self-generating many other beings, but the methods are different, and exactly which beings they generate are different. And a third ancient Egyptian cosmogony has the god Ptah, the patron god of Memphis, creating through thought and speech. Cosmologies are stories or theories of the order or structure of the universe. Cosmologies often come after cosmogony, and cosmogonies often start with theogonies or stories of the generations and creations of the gods. A common pattern you see in ancient religions is the three worlds or tripartite cosmology. The world above, heaven or sky, the middle world of earth, and the lower world or underworld. The dead are often thought of as living in the underworld or the grave, and many of the gods can come from the heaven, and they may be associated with heavenly bodies such as sun, moon, planets, stars. In Mesopotamia, the Atrahasis text has the story of a lottery in which the god Anu won heaven, Enlil won earth, and Ea won the underground waters. A lot of ancient cultures have a parallel story of how three gods, often three brothers, win each of the three worlds. Or there could be variations, like in ancient Greek religion, there was a story that Zeus won the sky, Poseidon won the ocean, and Hades won the earth. Cosmologies could involve cosmic conflicts, along that general theme I already mentioned of bringing order out of chaos. In ancient Mesopotamia, the god Marduk killed the serpent goddess Tiamat, and she gave birth to sea monsters. So she was basically a goddess of watery chaos. In Egypt, Ma'at, or order, waged an unending war against Isfet, or chaos. Ra, the sun god, descended into the underworld every night to do battle with Apophis, the evil serpent monster. In Greece, Zeus, the king of the gods, led his siblings, the Olympians, to overthrow the original king of the gods, his father Cronus. And they also overthrew the entire earlier generation of Titans. And this was echoing a pattern because Cronus had formerly overthrown his own father, Uranus, but Zeus was the last and final king of the gods. The story of this battle between the Olympians and the Titans is known as the Titanomachy, and this sculpture from Athens is believed to be a depiction of it, of Zeus smiting his father Cronus. Cosmology can also reflect the order of human society. So there can be these kind of hierarchies and different roles, duties, similar to how human governments could be divided into different responsibilities, ministries, agencies. In ancient Sumeria, there were 94 components of the divine or cosmic state. Every god had a specific duty, such as inspector of the canals, architect, border guardian, etc. Ninti, or Lady Rib, had the duty of tending to Enki, the god of wisdom, his sore rib. The Tablet of Destinies contained the inscribed duties of the gods. The cosmic state was believed to cease functioning if the tablet was hidden. Marduk defeated chaos, was able to recover the Tablet of Destinies, thus restoring order to the cosmos and legitimizing his rule as king of the gods. In Egypt, Ra, the sun god, was king of the cosmos, and the Egyptian king reenacted the sun's daily routine. So Egyptian religion often made a kind of equation or relationship between the king of the gods and the king of Egypt, although which god was regarded as king varied in different eras. Ancient Egyptian temples also served as models or microcosms of the cosmos as a whole. The border walls of the temple kept out chaos. There were processional passages modeled after the course of the sun across the sky during the day. And the inner sanctum of the temple modeled the world's primeval darkness. In ancient Greece, which is where we get the word cosmos from, it didn't originally mean world or universe. It meant arranged or ordered. But its use to describe the world suggests this idea of an orderly arrangement, and many Greeks thought of it as being under the governance of the gods, perhaps ruling through the motions of the planets. An anthropogeny is a theory of the origin of humans. In ancient Mesopotamian religion, there was a story that the lesser gods rebelled against the greater gods, so the greater gods created humans to serve them. Humans were made from clay with the blood of one of the rebel lesser gods. Thus, humans had inherited original sin from that rebel's blood. But, on the other hand, humans were created to serve the gods. In ancient Egyptian religion, Coffin Text 1130 says that Ra, the sun god, created humans from his tears. And Coffin Text 714 says that Ra wept because the other gods were angry at him. Thus, on this view, humans were created from the anger and self-pity of one of the gods. In ancient Greek religion, humans were said to have sprouted from soil watered by the blood of the Titans after their battle with the Olympians. The Roman poet Ovid said that humans are contemptuous of the gods. So the Roman religion inherited a lot of the beliefs of Greek religion. In Ovid's poetry, he talks a lot about Greek gods. Prometheus stole fire and gave it to humans. So Prometheus was one of the Titans, but he was regarded as benefiting humanity by violating the wish of the Olympians. Hesiod, an ancient Greek poet, had a theory of ages of the world. The original age, the Golden Age, was the best. The current age, the Iron Age, was the worst. And so there was a kind of gradual decline of the quality of humanity between these different ages. And anthropology is a theory of human nature. In Mesopotamian religion, and specifically in the text Atrahasis, it says that humans procreated too much and filled the earth. So the god Enlil sent a great flood to destroy them. But Atrahasis and his family were the only survivors. They repopulated the world, but then Ea created miscarriage and death to end the overpopulation. In ancient Egyptian religion, humans originally lived with the gods, but some humans rebelled, and Ra dispatched Hathor to punish them. Hathor became furious and killed humans indiscriminately. So Ra mixed ochre, red pigment, with beer. Hathor thought it was blood and drank it, but then became intoxicated from the beer, which allowed humans to survive. The gods then left humans on the earth and went up to heaven. In ancient Greek religion, the poet Homer said that human greed and folly doubled the suffering of humans. There is a big theme in ancient Greek tragedy and culture generally of hubris, or excessive pride, that led to the downfall of humans, or tragedy. The story of Daedalus and Icarus is an illustration of that. So, Daedalus was the greatest craftsman. He created wings that he and his son Icarus could use to fly. But Icarus flew too high, too close to the sun. The wax that held the wings together melted, and he fell to his death. Zeus sent a flood as retaliation for human sacrifice by Lycaon of Arcadia. Deucalion and Pyrrha were the sole survivors of that flood. There was a theme also in ancient religion of legitimation, that kings or other rulers were legitimized through their association with the gods. Many kings claimed divine ancestors. For example, the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III was claimed to have been fathered by the god Amun when he entered the queen's bedchamber. Much later, the Greek emperor Alexander the Great claimed that Zeus, which he associated with the Egyptian god Amun, visited his mother at his conception. Part 3. Worship. There were a large variety of services to the gods. They could be held at sacred places in nature or the outdoors, like caves, springs, groves, mountaintops, or crossroads. We get the word sacred, by the way, from the Latin word sacer, which means a place where contracts are made. So it illustrates the idea of the contractual relationship with the gods as really being fundamental to a lot of ancient religion. The Greek word hieros is derived from a word meaning powerful, but it could also be translated as sacred or holy. So sanctuaries were sacred places marked off by boundaries within which everything is sacred. They could be within homes, they could be in the countryside, they could be in neighborhoods in towns or cities, and they also could be temples. Temples are structures that house a sanctuary. An example from ancient Mesopotamia is a ziggurat, or a very large step temple. This ziggurat of Ur was one of the most famous. Rituals involved honoring, giving thanks to, or petitioning the gods. They would often involve feeding, clothing, sheltering, or giving gifts to the gods in exchange for things like a good harvest, offspring, safety, or health. So they were usually thought of as a kind of exchange or contract with the gods. An example from ancient Egypt is the opening of the mouth ritual. This was a special ritual in which a statue of a god was believed to become consecrated or divine, a divine living being. There was often anointing and dressing of divine statues and then feeding them with divine meals. In the picture is a version of the opening of the mouth ritual that was performed on the behalf of a deceased pharaoh. But the idea is just as the opening of the mouth ritual would make a statue of a god come alive, the opening of the mouth ritual for the deceased pharaoh would lead to his afterlife. The Egyptian word shayatu meant mystery, but it was used for rituals. Most rituals were performed in secret by priests in the inner sanctum. That was in ancient Egyptian religion specifically. You can see a reflection of that in ancient Judaism, where certain rituals would be performed in the Holy of Holies or the inner sanctum of the temple in Jerusalem. Sacrifice was a common way of worship. Sacrificial offerings could include first fruits or a harvest offering, fruits, grain, vegetables, or honeyed barley cakes. They could include libations or liquid offerings like wine, milk, or olive oil that would be poured. Animal sacrifice was usually ritually slaughtered by priests, but then eaten by priests and other worshippers. There were also votive gifts, which were treasures left at temples or in other locations for gods. Other examples include, or specific examples are lavish daily sacrifices that would be performed at Egyptian temples. The Egyptian temples were somewhat exceptional in this regard. It wasn't just on festivals that they would have large sacrifice, but every day at certain Egyptian temples. In ancient Greece and Rome, there'd be public animal sacrifices on important festivals. Sacrifices could be performed at altars or high places, and these might be left open to the elements so that smoke from the animal sacrifice, when it was being burned after, would rise to heaven. And then offerings to underworld gods were often poured as libations on the ground. Festivals often involved public processions of a god statue through a city or town or village, followed by hymns, sacrifice, games, cooking of sacrificial animals, and a communal banquet. So the procession, hymns, and sacrifice were often solemn, but then other parts of the festival, the games and the banquet or communal meal, would be more celebratory. In addition to worshiping the gods, these festivals would often strengthen and reaffirm communal bonds and the connections of the people with their gods. The ancient Greek Democritus said that the festival was as an inn or resting place on the road of life. In ancient Egypt, they did often take time off for family festivals, two major public festivals, and then there were 65 plus lesser festivals throughout the year. Ancient Athens had 170 festival days each year. But it's important to keep in mind that not all of these festivals were of equal significance. Some were minor, even though they were still widely participated in. In ancient Rome, they had fasti, or days for public business, and then a large number of nefasti, or festival days, 177 in total, including celebrations for 33 gods and several games as well. The painting on the right is a modern depiction of the ancient Greek Thesmophoria festival, which honored the goddesses Persephone and her mother Demeter. So priests were very important to these ancient religions. They were the main performers of rituals. Originally, normal citizens might be appointed for limited times to serve as priests. This was still done in later Roman religion. But in many cultures, as they developed, priesthood became a full-time profession, such as in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. Egyptian priests were known as the pure ones. They were circumcised, they were dressed in white, and they had various food taboos, such as not eating pork. Incidentally, some of these practices may have influenced ancient Judaism. They performed ablutions in basins at the entrance of temples. And the priests were usually attached to particular temples, such as the House of Life or the House of Books. And they had various moral injunctions and prohibitions against revealing the mysteries of their religion. This practice probably influenced the later Greek development of mystery religions. Mesopotamia had ritual cleansing and bathing houses before you were allowed to enter into the temple. And these included washing and burning incense. Incense was often used as purification, it could also be used as an offering. In ancient Greece and Rome, they had various practices. Hippocrates said sprinkling with holy water before entering a temple precinct was correct. At Ephesus, no entry was permitted to those who had committed murder, adultery, or used contraception or abortion. There was a Roman shrine in North Africa where shoes were not allowed, and you had to abstain for 3 days from women, wine, pork, beans, barbers, and public baths before entering. So that just gives you an example, but it gives you kind of general flavor of some of the prohibitions and customs around temples. There were a large number of female priests, at least in many cultures. Priestesses often, but not always, worshipped goddesses of marriage, pregnancy, or birth. There were many maiden priestesses of virgin goddesses, such as the ancient Greek goddess Persephone. There were also matron or mother priestesses of mother goddesses, such as Demeter, the goddess of grain. In ancient Sumeria, the highest ranking priestess was titled Lady Goddess. Sargon of Akkad had a daughter who was high priestess of the moon god Ur. And this was a custom of some of the other later dynasties in Mesopotamia as well. In ancient Greece, priestesses kept the keys to the temples, groomed cult statues, led prayers, and took part in some sacrifices. Ancient Rome had some female clergy, the Vestal Virgins. These preserved the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and they guarded the city's symbolic storehouse, which included official records, and they prepared objects used in certain public sacrifices. There were a lot of ceremonies, though, and worship done at homes, not just at temples by priests. An example is public festivals. People would often learn about myths from the festivals. Now, these could be done outdoors in the community, but the point is that they were not done in temples, and yet people would participate in them and learn about their religion thereby. Devotional objects were often found in homes. There was a famous Egyptian hand symbol, which represented the feminine side of Atum's creation, or the ivory hand of the goddess Hathor. There was also a popular symbol, the figurine of Isis and the infant Horus. There was also the kippus, which was a small stela with images of Horus battling dangerous animals. Home altars were often also present. They might have incense and other offerings to the gods. Spells was another side of religion that was often done outside of temples, and it might be a person going to a magical practitioner to get a spell done for healing or to have some other boon or blessing, some wish fulfilled. An example is Egyptian spells asking for the goddess Isis's protection for children. Isis had rebuked the god Ra when she found Horus dying. So Ra, the sun god, restored Horus to health. So that's why she would be one appropriate to petition for this need. Part 4, Afterlife. So there was often a desire to transcend death or the material world. Sometimes death was thought as an end, as in many periods in ancient Mesopotamian religion. Death could also be thought of as a passage, as in ancient Egyptian religion. And in later Greek and Roman religion, specifically with the mystery religions, there was thought to be a path you could go on to master death and have a blessed afterlife. An example of an ancient Mesopotamian myth involving death is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh was a famous Sumerian king, and Enkidu was his best friend and companion. They rescued the city of Uruk from this bull of heaven, this creature, mythical being really sent down from heaven, by killing it. But then, instead of offering the bull's thigh bone to the gods, Enkidu throws it to heaven as an act of hubris or defiance. So the gods decide that Enkidu must die. They curse him, he dies. His friend, the king Gilgamesh, is overcome with disbelief, rage, and grief. So he orders craftsmen to make a statue of Enkidu, and he inters treasure with Enkidu and sacrifices animals to the gods for a banquet. Funeral rites in ancient religions would often have several distinct phases. There was the laying out of the body for washing, anointing, and dressing. A coin might be placed in the mouth or in the hand or on both eyes in ancient Greek religion, for example. This was for Charon, the ferryman across the river Styx, which led to the land of the dead. The body was then placed on a bier for the family to pay final respects, and there would be a procession with mourners to the burial site. The body might be cremated or interred with offerings of food, wine, and goods for the afterlife, and then the family returned home for a banquet and sacrifices. Rites for the dead were often performed at the gravesite on the anniversary of the deceased's death. There were also communal festivals for the dead. In Athens, there were the festivals of Genesia and Antisteria. Ceres was a female death spirit honored in the Antisteria, and the festival also involved ceramic wine vessels that be given as gifts. In Rome, there was Parentalia, which honored the ancestors, and Lemuria, which was dedicated to those who had not received a proper burial. The land of the dead, or the underworld, was often conceived as a gloomy, dark place, like a cavern. In Mesopotamian religion, the dead were thought to live on as spirits, but the afterlife was gloomy and no one looked forward to it. In ancient Judaism, or the religion of the ancient kingdom of Israel, the dead were believed to go to Sheol, or the grave. In ancient Greek religion, in the book The Odyssey by the poet Homer, Achilles, hero of the Greeks who died in the Trojan War, tells Odysseus that he would rather work the soil as someone's hired hand than be the ruler of all the dead, the entire underworld. So there was a post-mortem existence, but it was thought of as pretty depressing. Hades was the god of the dead and the underworld in ancient Greek religion, but also the name for the land of the dead. In later Greek religion, Tartarus was thought of as a place of punishment for just particular gods or people that the other gods wanted to punish, not for everyone. And Elysium was a very happy afterlife, but just available to a few. In ancient Egypt, death was looked upon as a passageway to a potential new existence. In the Old Kingdom of Egypt, only the rulers and high-ranking officials could have a blessed afterlife. Bread, beer, furniture, and jewelry offerings would be left in the tombs for the deceased. There were also offerings painted on the tomb walls. There were pyramid texts or books with prayers, spells, and hymns for the deceased. Middle Kingdom Egypt had the belief that any elite person, not just rulers, could have an afterlife, but they still had to pay for the proper ceremonies and have the proper objects made. Osiris was god of the dead and the underworld, and he became more important than Ra, the sun god, in post-mortem rituals in the Middle Kingdom period. There were also coffin texts. These were painted on coffins, and they contained many spells and maps of the underworld. There was a belief of divine judgment as well, that the heart of the deceased would be weighed on the scales of truth before the god Osiris, and if it was heavier than the feather of Ma'at, or righteousness, then the person would have no happy afterlife or no eternity. In later Greek and Roman religion, there were various views about death and the afterlife that developed. The mystery religions claimed to have secret knowledge and direct experience of the divine that was reserved for initiated members. They promised a good afterlife for initiates. The philosopher Pythagoras believed that the soul, or psyche, was immortal and reincarnated. That was not the general view of ancient Greek religion, but he influenced some other thinkers and followers, such as Plato. Plato argued for a dualism of soul and body, but he thought that the soul in its nature was immortal. In his dialogue to Phaedrus, souls after their death encounter an eternal realm of pure light. This is the world of the forms, essentially, where they get knowledge of true being. Epicurus said that, quote, death is nothing to us, since when we exist, death does not. But when death is present, then we do not exist, unquote. So he did not believe in an afterlife, but he thought this was a good thing because there was nothing to fear, and that when you don't exist, you have no problems, essentially. The Stoics believed that the soul is rational in its nature, while the body is irrational. The Stoic philosopher Seneca said, quote, death is either an end or a transition, end quote, and hence either way not to be feared. There's a Roman epitaph that says, I was not, I am not, I care not. The Neoplatonist philosophers were later followers of Plato, who lived many centuries after his death, essentially during the Roman Empire period. They believed the soul is trapped in matter and must be liberated. In this regard, they were like Plato, but some of the later Neoplatonists also developed quasi-religious rituals called theurgy to assist in this process. Section 2.4, Mesopotamian Religion. We're going to divide this one into several subsections just because there's kind of a lot. First, a brief historical view, and then a list of some of the main Mesopotamian gods, a section on the relation between humans and gods, a section on divination practices, and then a look at some of the main myths and texts of ancient Mesopotamia. Part 1, Historical Overview. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. It's a reference to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It corresponds approximately to the modern nation of Iraq. This was one of the main epicenters of Bronze Age civilization, and it may have the oldest cities in antiquity. The earliest phase of Mesopotamian civilization is Sumer. Sumer was the Akkadian name for the pre-Semitic inhabitants of Mesopotamia. Later inhabitants of the region spoke a variety of Semitic languages. Kengir, or country of the noble lords, is Sumerians' own name for their land. So they had their own language that was not related to that of surrounding lands. They were divided into many city-states. So each city and the surrounding territory was essentially its own nation. The cities were generally centered on a ziggurat or pyramid temple to the patron god of the city. They would be ruled by a priestly governor or by a king who had a priestly function, performing religious rituals. Some of the later rulers claimed to be divine. Nippur in particular was regarded as an axis mundi, or center of the cosmos, connecting heaven and earth. They had the earliest form of writing, cuneiform, which they wrote on clay tablets, many of which have been preserved very well over thousands of years. The script was originally ideograms, where the writing would be a picture of what it was representing, but later they developed logograms, which would take an ideogram symbol but essentially change the meaning, either based on the sound or some other association. Hundreds of thousands of texts in cuneiform have survived. They were baked clay, so they were pretty robust. They wouldn't, rot, for example, as easily as paper or papyrus. One thing as well is that the ancient coastline was much further inland than today. The coastline has basically expanded outward to the southeast because of the centuries of deposits of sand from the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. The Akkadian Empire was the first Mesopotamian empire, and it lasted from around 2334 to 2154 BC. The Akkadians, unlike the Sumerians, spoke a Semitic language. They ruled both over Akkadians and they also conquered Sumeria. The exact location of Akkad has actually been lost, but we know the name of the founder of the Akkadian Empire, Sargon of Akkad. He appears as a legendary figure in the Neo-Assyrian literature of the 8th to 7th centuries BC. But he conquered cities and forced them to pay tribute to Akkad, even though he allowed them to keep their own local customs. The Akkadian language became used for the imperial administration, and they standardized weights and measures throughout the empire. After the fall of the Akkadian Empire, there was the Gutian dynasty, which conquered Sumer. They were from the eastern mountains, but their language was unknown. Then there was the so-called Third Dynasty of Ur, or the Neo-Sumerian Empire. This was the last prominent Sumerian dynasty. After this, it was mainly Semitic-speaking peoples and others that dominated the region. Then there was the Old Babylonian period from around 1894 to 1595 BC. Babylonians spoke a Semitic language. Hammurabi was the creator of the Babylonian Empire. He codified the laws of Babylon in the Code of Hammurabi, and henceforth Sumer became known as Babylonia. The Babylonian religion featured Babylon becoming a religious center of Mesopotamia, thus supplanting the more ancient cities of Nippur and Eridu. The kings of Babylon did not claim to be divine. They worshipped gods such as Shamash, the sun god, and Marduk. Shamash was originally the main god of the Babylonian religion, but Marduk was the patron of the city of Babylon, and so later he became prominent. The Middle Babylonian period began in 1595 when the Hittites, a people from Anatolia, modern Turkey, who spoke an Indo-European language, sacked Babylon. The Kassites then took over Babylon and established the Kassite dynasty, or the Middle Babylonian period. There was extensive religious and cultural continuity, though, with the previous Old Babylonian period. The same gods were worshipped, for example. The Middle Babylonian period ended with the Assyrian invasion from around 1232 to 1225 BC and the Elamite invasion around 1158 BC. So there were invasions of West Semitic peoples such as Arameans, Suteans, and Chaldeans. The Late Bronze Age collapse was a significant event in the history of human civilization. This was from around 1200 to 1150 BC. There were widespread collapses of civilizations throughout the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. The affected areas included Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Greece, the Balkans, and Eastern Libya. So you see the collapse of the ancient Mycenaean Greek civilization, whose writing systems, for example, never recovered. The Hittite Empire, which basically never comes back, and the kingdoms in Cyprus, Syria, and the Levant. Egypt and Mesopotamia were severely disrupted by invasions, but they did survive. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was the largest empire up to that time in human history. It used the languages Akkadian and Aramaic as its official languages because they were already more widely spoken. The Neo-Assyrian ruler Sennacherib faced a rebellion from Babylon. Sennacherib destroyed Babylon and the temple of Marduk in the city. He was then assassinated by two of his sons. His heir Esarhaddon regarded the death of his father as divine retribution for sacrilege against Marduk, so he rebuilt Babylon and the Temple of Marduk. Assurbanipal was the last major Assyrian emperor who was infamous for his brutality, massacring rebellious citizens. He created a giant library, however. His goal was to collect all of knowledge in one place, but to create it, he stole the archives from Babylonian temples and placed them in his own library in Nineveh. Many of the 30,000 texts were actually collections of omens. He hired scholars to prepare a new canon of texts, including many diviners and scribes. The text Enuma, Anu, and Enlil was a collection of 7,000 celestial or astrological omens. Of interest was that it classified 30-day months as auspicious. That was the original calendar established by the god Marduk. But months which couldn't conform to that in their number of days were regarded as inauspicious. So he had a large staff of scribes and diviners who served as advisors. There were seven scribes who interpreted omens, 9 exorcists, 5 haruspikis. These performed haruspiki or extispiki, which was divination by entrails of sacrificed animals. He had 6 lamentation singers, 3 augurs who performed augury or divination by birds, and he had 3 Egyptian experts on divination rituals. He also used reports from astrologers who he had dispersed throughout his empire. So you can see the real importance of divination for ancient Mesopotamian culture, and a lot of that was connected with gods as well as astrological observations. The Neo-Babylonian Empire lasted from 626 to 539 BC. It's also known as the Chaldean dynasty. Nabopolassar was king of Babylon who rebelled against the Assyrians. He allied with the Medes to defeat the Assyrians, and the Assyrian Empire collapsed in 612 BC. The Medes sacked Assur in 614, which was the Assyrian homeland and religious center. The Babylonians and Medes then sacked Nineveh, their capital, in 612 BC. And the Medes, they sacked temples without pity, without remorse. Nebuchadnezzar II was famous for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. He defeated Egypt at the famous Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. And he destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BC after a revolt by King Zedekiah of Judah. That was a very important event for Judaism, leading to the Babylonian captivity of Jews. Nebuchadnezzar II forced many of the Jews to go into exile in Babylon. The Achaemenid Persian Empire lasted from around 550 to 330 BC, and it ruled Mesopotamia for much of that time. The empire was founded by Cyrus or Kurash the Great, who ruled from 559 to 530 BC. So he revolted against the Astyages of Media in 549 BC, defeated them, became ruler of the Elamites and Gudians, and established the Achaemenid Empire thereby. He invaded Babylon in 539 BC. He defeated King Nabonidus of Babylon, but he did not sack the Temple of Marduk, and he ended the Babylonian captivity of the Jews and of other foreign exiles. So he was actually celebrated, for example, as a liberator in the Hebrew Bible. The Cyrus Cylinder is a text that justified his conquest of Babylonia as the will of the god Marduk. Part 2. Gods. There were many Sumerian gods. Enlil was the storm god and the original king of the gods. His main temple was in the city of Nippur. Ninlil was the wife of Enlil and queen of heaven and earth. Utu was god of the sun, justice, and light. He was son of Nana and Ningal, and the twin brother of Inanna. Shamash was the sun god, and you can see in this depiction of him the waves on his clothing. Those are supposed to be symbolic of rays of light. Nana was god of the moon. And you can see in this cylinder seal that Nana is depicted as a crescent moon. Enki is god of wisdom, water, crafts, and creation. He's one of the Anunnaki, a class of gods, and he's the patron god of Eridu. He was associated with the planet Mercury. Inanna was the goddess of love and war, and she was associated with the planet Venus. Nergal was the god of war, death, and disease, the ruler of the underworld, Kur. His main temple was in Kuta, and he was associated with the planet Mars. Sulpe was god of disease, husband of Ninursag, and associated with the planet Jupiter. Ninhurta was the god of farming, healing, and later of war. His chief temple was in the city Nippur, and he was associated with the planet Saturn. Ninhursag was the mother goddess of the mountains and goddess of fertility. On, the sky god, and later was king of the gods. Ki, the earth goddess, chief consort of On, and the Anunnaki were the children of On and Ki. They were like the fates of the ancient Sumerian religion. The Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian gods had different names because these people spoke Semitic languages, but most of them were associated with earlier Sumerian deities. Anu was the Akkadian version of On, the sky god. Enlil was the Babylonian version of Enlil, the storm god. Ea was the Babylonian version of Enki, god of wisdom, possibly the same as Yah, the Canaanite god, who may have been connected to Yahweh, the god of the Israelites. Shamash was the Babylonian version of Utu, the sun god. Sin was the Babylonian version of Nana, the moon god, whose main temple was in the city of Haran. Nabu was the son of Marduk and associated with the planet Mercury. Ishtar was the Babylonian version of Inanna, goddess of love and war, associated with the planet Venus. Nergal was the same as the Sumerian deity of the same name, god of death, associated with the planet Mars. Marduk was the patron deity of Babylon and king of the gods, replacing the earlier Enlil. He was associated with the planet Jupiter. Astur was the patron deity of Assyria and was the Assyrian king of the gods, replacing Marduk. And Ninurta was the same as the Sumerian and was associated with the planet Saturn. So all of these planetary associations are the ultimate source of the fact that we have names of the planets derived from Greek or Roman gods, because these cultures just associated their own gods with those of the earlier Babylonians, who had associated their gods with the planets. Part 3. Relation between humans and gods. There was a notion of bonds between heaven and earth, and the cities and their temples functioned as places that linked the two. There were mooring ropes used that symbolized the bond between heaven and earth. So they would use this on their visual depictions. Nippur was the Sumerian city regarded as the original axis mundi, or symbolic center of the cosmos. Babylon was known as the gateway of the gods, and it later was regarded as an axis mundi in Mesopotamia. Eremenanki was the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, the largest and most important ziggurat or step pyramid temple in Babylon, and was probably the inspiration for the Tower of Babel in the Hebrew Bible. Many gods had a chief temple in a particular city, such as the god Sin, moon god. His chief temple was in Haran. This was a center of trade in northern Mesopotamia for 4,000 years. And Sin also had a major cult center in the city of Ur. This might be related to the biblical story of Abraham, who is from Ur. Alat means goddess in Arabic, and this was also a later goddess in the city of Haran. Worship of Alat in Haran continued for centuries after the Muslim conquest. These ruins that are in the picture were not from the Mesopotamian period, but from a later civilization who built on the same site. So the relationship between humans and gods was thought of in terms of reciprocity. Humans would give the gods food offerings, but it was observed that humans could still suffer even if they gave offerings to the gods. The god Enki gave Inanna control over both love and war, and this was thought of as explaining the connection between these two sides of human existence. Enlil dealt with his divine wrath by sending disasters to humans, including the demon Namtar, or fate. Kingship was often associated with religion. The Sumerian king list was an early Sumerian text that portrays kingship as descended from heaven, and the king as holding the mooring rope that connects heaven and earth. Inanna and Ishtar were the names for the goddess associated with kingship. Queens would lead religious processions to cities and construct new temples. Royal daughters would often serve as high priestesses, following the example set by Sargon, king of Ur. Queen mothers would dedicate offerings to protect the crown prince. Ninhursag was a goddess who nursed kings at her breast, so she was regarded as a divine queen mother. Naram Sin was the grandson of Sargon, and he was the first Mesopotamian ruler to claim divine status, and later kings often followed in that trend. In the Ur III dynasty, the kings circulated movable shrines containing their idol throughout their kingdom. The Akidu festival was a famous 10-day Babylonian New Year festival. The first 3 days were preparatory. They would involve secret rituals performed by priests of Marduk in the temple. And the fourth day, there'd be a public reading of the Enuma Elish, important mythological text for ancient Babylonian civilization. The role of the king in this was also very interesting. The king would lay down his scepter before the statue of Marduk. The priest would slap the king. The king would then prostrate himself before the statue, and the priest would slap the king again. If the king cried, the coming year would be fortunate. So it really incentivized the priest to slap the king hard. This is illustrating very graphically the idea that the king, although subject to no human authority, is subject to a divine authority. Then there would be a procession of the statue of Marduk taken through the decorated city streets to his festival house outside the city wall. At the end of the festival, the statue of Marduk would return to his temple inside the city, entering via the Ishtar gate and following the processional way, which was decorated with glazed bricks painted with 120 roaring lions. King Nabonidus of Babylon sought to replace worship of Marduk with that of the moon god, Sin. In so doing, he was influenced by his mother, who was a native of the city of Haran, which was the main base for the cult of Sin. Nabonidus refused to participate in the Akidu festival, which honored Marduk. He restored temples to Sin in Haran and Ur, and revived the practice of appointing his daughter as high priestess to Sin, and he converted several temples of Marduk to worship Sin instead. The priests of Marduk therefore hated Nabonidus, and they welcomed their conquest by the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus was indeed more kind of tolerant of other religions and cultures than had been King Nabonidus. Part 4. Divination. Divination is a method for predicting the future or gaining other hidden information. And in the early Sumerian period, this was mainly an oral tradition, but later a lot of these methods were written down. So the Sumerians and later Mesopotamians used divination to learn of their destiny. It was thought that a person's destiny was determined at birth and inscribed on the tablets of existence. A negative prognostication could be altered to a degree, however. The Enme Duranki was a mythical sage king and ancestor of later diviners. He was called the Lord of the powers of the bond of heaven and earth. In the picture are clay models of livers that would be used by diviners to help guide their haruspiki, or divination based on examining the livers of sacrificed animals. Omens were very important in ancient Mesopotamian culture. Itu was the Akkadian word for a sign or omen. This might be similar to the Arabic word ayah, which is used to refer to messages from Allah or verses of the Quran. There were two main types of omen: diagnostic, which is based on physical or behavioral characteristics, and predictive, based on a person's fate, or shimtu, that which has been decreed. There were also unprovoked omens based on natural phenomena such as stars, unusual births, or thunder on cloudless days, or the flight of birds. There were many different divination texts and methods. After the Sumerian period and the Old Babylonian period, divination texts were written down, and they were mainly collections of omens. So there were different parts of the divination ritual. There would be a preparatory ritual, then a petition of the god Shamash to establish the truth or kittim of the reading, followed by the divination method itself. And here are some of the common divination methods during this period: pouring oil into water, examining the liver of a sacrificial sheep, and astrology. The Enuma Anu Enlil is an Assyrian omen collection containing 7,000 celestial or astrological omens. Tablet 14, for example, contains formulas for calculating the visibility of the moon and the length of the night. These formulas were based on the sacred organization of time by the god Marduk in the Enuma Elish, Book 6. In other words, they did not match actual astronomy. They were kind of a sacred ideal. Now, if the world happened to match the ideal sacred time, then this was a good omen. But whenever the real world calendar or astrological motions diverged, the omen was bad. So, for example, 30-day months were auspicious, but months of other lengths were inauspicious. The Code of Hammurabi was authored by King of Babylon, Hammurabi, who ruled from 1792 to 1750 BC. It was a code of laws, but it had the same format as the earlier omen collections. They were lists of if-then statements. When this stylistic fact suggests a parallel between divine law or fate and this human law. Ketum meant truth and justice, and was similar to the Egyptian concept of Ma'at. Hammurabi's stela shows the king receiving the law from Shamash, god of justice, who's wearing a horned crown symbolizing his divinity. Babylonian astrology combined astronomy, or descriptions of celestial phenomena, with astrology, or divination, based on celestial phenomena. Astrology was originally practiced only by the court astrologers, diviners who served the king. But by the 5th century BC, many commoners in Babylon also consulted astrologers, and most of the late cuneiform texts were actually astrological in nature. Horoscopes became increasingly popular in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, and essentially, this is the 4th century to BC to 4th century AD. This is how Babylonian astrology entered into Greek, Roman, and then later Western culture. So the legacy of Babylonian astrology was kind of set during the later Roman period. During the Roman Empire, Romans adopted Babylonian astrology. Babylon was a ruin by the 1st century AD, but the Romans continued to admire their astrology and divination, and pilgrims would still visit Marduk's temple as late as the 3rd century AD. The Christian Roman Emperor Justinian banned pagan Greek philosophy, though, in the late 6th century AD. There was a Greek philosopher who thus fled, moving to Ctesiphon, which was then capital of the Sasanian or Persian Empire. It was near the ruins of Babylon, and from there he wrote On First Beginnings, which opened with the retelling of the Enuma Elish. So that's just kind of like a later example of the lasting legacy and influence of Babylonian culture. Part 5, Myths and Texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the most famous ancient Mesopotamian work of literature. The original Sumerian version was based on disparate stories about the hero king Gilgamesh, but later there was an old Babylonian version made by Hammurabi that was a single extended narrative that was cohesive. It focused on Gilgamesh's quest for immortality. The quest was ultimately fruitless, for the gods had assigned death to humans, and it's noteworthy that Hammurabi and other Babylonian kings did not claim to be gods. The standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh is from the late 2nd millennium BC. The first line says, "He who saw the deep." It has a lot of religious and philosophical themes, so it's classified as wisdom literature. Gilgamesh was the king of the city of Uruk, Enkidu his best friend and companion in arms. They had an adventure in the cedar forest of Lebanon, which was the realm of the gods. They fought Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. They entered the forest to cut down cedars, and eventually Gilgamesh killed Humbaba, though, who cursed Enkidu. They later encountered Ishtar, the goddess of love, who asked Gilgamesh to become her lover, but Gilgamesh mocked and insulted Ishtar. Ishtar then asked Anu to send down the Bull of Heaven to get revenge. The Bull of Heaven was a celestial creature combining the features of a bull. It had wings, though, and other features too, similar to the Lamassu from ancient Mesopotamian religion, or cherubim from ancient Judaism. Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed the Bull of Heaven, but Enkidu then offended the gods and was doomed to die. And Gilgamesh mourned his friend's death and determined to become immortal, so he went on this quest. He eventually contacted Utnapishtim, who was the sole survivor of the ancient Great Flood, who lived in the island of Dilmun. The Great Flood in ancient Mesopotamian belief is similar to the idea of the Great Flood in the Hebrew Bible. Enlil, the king of the gods, was angry at humans for making so much noise and decided to kill them with the flood. Ea, the god of wisdom, warned Utnapishtim and told him how to escape. After 40 days, the flood receded, and Utnapishtim offered a sacrifice to the gods. The gods were angry at Enlil for depriving them of their offerings from humans during that period. Utnapishtim, when he met Gilgamesh, criticized him for being a tyrant like the god Enlil. Utnapishtim also told Gilgamesh that it was impossible for humans to become immortal. The Enuma Elish was the most famous religiously themed Mesopotamian text. It means the epic of creation. It's a hymn of praise to Marduk. It was probably composed to celebrate the return of Marduk's statue after it was captured by enemies. It tells of the creation of the cosmos, with Marduk defeating the monsters Tiamat and Kingu and creating order. Marduk used the body of Tiamat to structure the cosmos. It also tells of the creation of humans. Marduk created humans from a mixture of the blood of Kingu and soil. Humanity's original sin was thus from the blood of Kingu, a violent rebel against the king of the gods. The Epic of Era has the story of humans abandoning self-restraint and indulging in violence and impiety. Marduk, upset, departs to the netherworld, abandoning humans. Then Era, the god of violence, instigates further violence, and Babylon is plundered. Marduk returns, ends the violence, and saves Babylon. The final tablet of the Epic of Era was shaped into an amulet and hung on the wall of a house for salvation and protection from harm. It has the character Kapti Ilani Marduk. Marduk, most honored of the gods. This is the narrator of the Epic of Era. Other names in the Epic of Era are in the form of prayers, similar to laments, and also compared to ancient Hebrew names, for having a structure that includes the name of a god and some meaning connected to it. Prayers are often requested for forgiveness for transgressions, and a god's abandonment was regarded as an illness that should be treated by an exorcist, and there was a relation between physical and spiritual healing. The picture shows an ancient amulet to warn off the plague, specifically the one invoking the god Era. Lodlo Bel Nameki means I will praise the Lord of Wisdom. It was also called the poem of the righteous sufferer. It portrays Marduk as an all-powerful, inscrutable, and as being both wrathful and merciful. Marduk's wrath falls upon the narrator, a righteous man. He suffers physical illnesses and alienation from other people. This is overall similar to the book of Job from the Hebrew Bible. The narrator directs a lament to Marduk, but Marduk does not relent. The narrator then consults an exorcist, then a diviner, then a dream interpreter, then petitions a personal deity, all to no avail. But the righteous narrator never repudiates the god Marduk. The narrator's salvation lies in faith that Marduk will ultimately be merciful. The author of this text was likely an exorcist. Exorcism depended on Marduk for effectiveness. The theology of Mesopotamian religion gradually changed. The Enuma Elish and the Ludlul praise Marduk, and they show an evolution towards monotheism. Other gods became names for aspects of Marduk. Here's an example. Sin is your divinity, Anu your sovereignty, Dagon is your lordship, Enlil your kingship, Adad is your might, wise Ea your perception, Nabu, holder of the tablet stylus, is your skill. Your leadership in battle is Ninurta, your might Nergal. Your counsel is Nusku, your judgment is radiant Shamash. Your eminent name is Marduk, sage of the gods. This is similar to later Jewish, Christian, and Muslim lists of the names of gods. Later, Assyrian emperors made other gods aspects of Assur, their king of the gods. The winged solar disk was often used as symbols of gods, especially divine rulers, in ancient Mesopotamian religion. Section 2.5, Egyptian religion. Egyptian history is divided into three main periods: Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. The pyramids of Giza are one of the most famous creations of the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom lasted from around 2686 to 2181 BC. You can see on the map that Egypt was divided into Lower, Middle, and Upper. Lower Egypt is by the delta, which is closest to the sea, and thus it's lower elevation-wise. Middle and Upper Egypt were further to the south, but they were higher elevation-wise. They were nearer to the sources of the Nile. The sun god Ra became prominent in Old Kingdom religion from the 5th dynasty onward. The pyramid complex of Giza had multiple pyramids and other structures. The Great Pyramid was built by the king or pharaoh Khufu. There was the Pyramid of Khafre and the Pyramid of Menkaure, and also the Great Sphinx. The Middle Kingdom lasted from 2055 to 1650 BC. Osiris, god of the dead, became the most popular deity during this period. It ended with the invasion of a people from the north, the Hyksos, who may have been Semitic. The New Kingdom lasted from 1550 to 1069 BC. The pharaoh Amenhotep III built the Luxor Temple, a large complex dedicated to the Theban triad, three gods: Amun, king of the gods; Mut, Amun's wife; and Khonsu, Amun's son. His successor, Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten, attempted to reform Egyptian religion significantly. The New Kingdom is also called the Egyptian Empire because Egypt expanded to conquer Canaan and other lands to the north. There were many Egyptian gods. Here are some of the main ones. Amun was the creator god and father of Shu and Tefnut. Shu was god of air, peace, and lions. Tefnut was goddess of rain and moisture. Ra was god of the sun. Amun was king of the gods originally and the patron deity of the city of Thebes. Hathor was goddess of cows. Thoth or Tot was god of scribes. Osiris was god of vegetation. He was killed by Set, but posthumously fathered the god Horus with the help of his wife Isis. He later became judge and lord of the dead. So Isis was the wife of Osiris and queen of heaven. Horus was the son of Osiris and god of the sky and kingship. Set was the brother and murderer of Osiris. He was the god of deserts, storms, and violence. Egyptian religion was often described, or is described nowadays by scholars, as mortuary religion, or that was a large component of it, because it was focused on preparing the dead for the afterlife. The purpose of elaborate tombs and coffins was in large part so the deceased would be remembered. Later, the idea developed that righteousness was the key to surviving after death. The Egyptians had many names for different parts of a person's soul or spirit, but one of the names was Akh, which means intellect. It could also be used as a general name for a spirit of the dead. Egyptians sought to be remembered by preserving their body in a tomb and by preserving their name through adherence to Ma'at, or righteousness. In the picture is a box containing ushabtis, which are small figurines that would be left as offerings for the deceased. Ma'at means order, truth, or justice. It was created by Atum and maintained by the gods. Humans had to treat others well in order to serve the gods, and all humans were believed to be created alike. In the Old Kingdom, rulers identified themselves as the Lord of Ma'at, and judges used the title Divine Priest of Ma'at. Thoth, the god of scribes, wrote the hieroglyph for Ma'at, which was a feather sign. Ma'at became a goddess with the feather headdress by the end of the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom version of the mortuary religion is typified by Unas, the last major Old Kingdom ruler. He was the one who actually began the practice of elaborate decorations of tomb chambers to make them a kind of symbolic microcosm or small world that corresponded to the macrocosm or large world. He had a black coffin which represents the dark soil of the Nile River. The ancient Egyptian name for Egypt, Kem, meant dark or this black soil. The ceiling of the tomb had stars of the night sky, to which the pharaoh would ascend after death. The walls were covered with text painted blue to symbolize the waters of creation, and there were pyramid texts on the walls that contained spells to assist the deceased in the afterlife. Unas sought to become one with the sun god Ra in heaven, as well as to become identified with Osiris, god of the dead. But Ma'at was regarded as necessary for having an afterlife. The Middle Kingdom mortuary religion was characterized by a shift from tomb to coffin. The coffins were decorated with coffin texts. These contained spells to assist the dead to reach the afterlife. The physical tomb also mattered less than the person's righteousness, which was regarded as eternal. The judgment of the dead was conceived as the soul coming before the god Osiris. Their heart was placed on a scale to be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, or justice. And during this period, other elite Egyptians, not just the king, aspired to become Osiris after death. The New Kingdom mortuary religion included the famous text, the Book of the Dead. This told of the deceased appearing before a tribunal of Osiris and 42 other divine judges. The deceased would make public confession, declaring their innocence with respect to 82 commandments. In the instruction of Amenemope, it says that the hated man or a violent abuser was to be contrasted with the silent man, and the greedy man or oppressor of the weak with the decent man. Only the righteous would have an afterlife. There was a new notion of piety that developed as intimacy with the gods, so a more personal relationship. Akhenaten was originally known as the pharaoh Amenhotep IV, but he changed his name Akhenaten, which meant effective for Aten. He prioritized worship of the god Aten at the expense of other gods, in particular Amun and Mut. His wife was Nefertiti. Aten was the god of sun and light. He first identified Aten with Atum, a creator god, but later with the god Ra. He composed the great hymn which emphasizes Aten's role as creator. Akhenaten's description of Aten were often non-anthropomorphic, a solar disk with rays of light coming out. So he built the city of Akhetaten, which corresponds to modern Amarna. It was a new capital dedicated to the god Aten. We've unearthed many texts from it, the Amarna letters, 400 cuneiform tablets, and they're an important source of information on Egypt's relationship with its neighboring kingdoms. So we don't know exactly what the religious significance of Aten's reform was. Probably he just wanted to emphasize the worship of this new god Aten, and perhaps a new conception of deity that was less anthropomorphic. but previously scholars used to interpret Akhenaten's reforms as a kind of monotheism. This may not have been the case, however. Certainly, though, he upturned the course of affairs in ancient Egyptian religion, angering priests of other gods that he demoted. His son Tutankhamun is famous. He restored the traditional Egyptian religion under the direction of the priests. In later history, Egyptians continued to practice their mortuary traditions. Egypt was conquered by a series of foreign empires, including the Persian Empire, who ruled Egypt for a couple hundred years, and then Alexander the Great. Alexander's empire didn't last beyond his death in 323 BC, but it was divided up among his generals into various successor kingdoms, and the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for several centuries. The Book of the Dead continued to be used, and a 4th century BC Greek traveler noted that Egyptians cared more for their tombs or their everlasting homes than for their normal homes, which they regarded as temporary inns. Even in the Roman period, after they conquered Ptolemaic Egypt, new funerary texts were created modeled on the Book of the Dead, such as the Book of Passing Through Eternity, and some of the old Egyptian mortuary customs were still practiced, at least until the coming of Christianity, which mostly ended them. The Koyak festival was a very famous, important later Egyptian festival. All of the periods of conquest and political instability actually led to increased piety among Egyptians. Egyptians flocked to temples and participated in many festivals. During the Koyak festival, there were 42 separate limbs of the god Osiris that were embalmed, taken on a procession with statues of patron deities of Egypt's 42 districts, and then buried as onlookers beat themselves in grief of the reenacted death of Osiris. Worshippers looked on with hope to the resurrection of the god Osiris. The festival was a memorial to the past of Egypt and a lament at the Roman occupation. 2.6 Greek Religion. Greek history basically begins with the Mycenaean period, which was during the Bronze Age. It lasted from around 1750 to 1050 BC. This is when there are palaces, small towns, art, and a type of writing called Linear B appearing for the first time in ancient Greece. It's named after Mycenae, which is one of the main palaces. They appear to practice an early form of ancient Greek religion that have some gods and goddesses in common with later Greek religion, like Poseidon, god of the sea, and Athena, goddess of craft and wisdom. It was followed by the Greek Dark Ages, which lasted from around 1100 to 750 BC. This initiated in the late Bronze Age collapse and involved violent migrations. Writing was actually lost, and the settlements decreased in size and complexity. The Archaic period lasted from around 800 to 480 BC, and it followed the Dark Ages. This featured the rise of the polis, or city-state, and a new Greek alphabet was created based on the Phoenician alphabet. Greek colonies were also founded throughout the Mediterranean. This period ended with the Persian Wars, when the Achaemenid Persian Empire to the east attempted to conquer Greece. The classical period followed that of the Archaic period. This is what we usually think of as ancient Greece, the most famous accomplishments of the civilization, and this is the period often taken as a reference point for ancient Greek religion. There were many city-states that were prominent in this time. Two of the famous ones are Athens and Sparta. Athens is especially famed for being a mercantile and navy power and having a democratic government for part of its history. Sparta was famous for having a very militaristic society. Citizens were trained in the art of war from a young age, in part because they had a large subject population which they feared would rebel, the Helots. After the Greeks were able to defeat the Persian Empire, prevent them from conquering Greece, Athens formed a league of allied Greek city-states called the Delian League to ostensibly allow themselves to be stronger against the Persian threat should they invade in the future. But Athens started to pressure its allies to become more like subjects to it. This prompted Sparta to form its own rival league. These two leagues eventually clashed in the Peloponnesian War, which lasted for many decades but resulted in the defeat of Athens. Alexander the Great ruled from 336 to 323 BC. Following his death, there was a period known as the Hellenistic period, which lasted for several centuries. Alexander the Great was king of Macedon, a kingdom to the north of Greece, but he conquered Greece. He was an admirer of Greek culture. He then went on to conquer the Persian Empire and spread Greek culture where he went. There were many successor states that were basically the survivors of Alexander's empire after it broke up. So the kingdom of Macedon remained. The Seleucid dynasty ruled Syria and other parts of the Near East. The Ptolemies ruled in Egypt. There were also other kingdoms like Gandhara or Bactria in what's now Afghanistan, and later the Indo-Greek kingdom in what's now northwestern India or South Asia, including Pakistan. So during this period, Greek culture, language, and religion spread throughout the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean because a lot of these successor states were ruled by Greek kings, and there were Greeks traveling around as merchants, as craftsmen to work in the new towns and cities, and so on. Hesiod was a very famous ancient Greek poet, one of the first authors to describe the birth, appearance, epithets, powers, and behaviors of the gods. He lived from around 750 to 650 BC. His theogony contains stories of the creation and births of the gods. This is a complex series of generations, but two of the first gods are Uranus, god of heaven, and Gaia, goddess of the earth. They give birth to the Titans, which is the earliest generation of Greek gods. The original king of the gods is Kronos, but he devoured his children. This is because he was afraid of the prophecy which said that one of his children would rise up against him. However, through a clever ruse, Zeus was preserved from being swallowed by his father. A stone was substituted instead, and he grew up, was able to defeat his father in battle, and cause his father to vomit forth all of his siblings who had previously been devoured, and they fought against and defeated the rest of the Titans. These gods were the Olympians, and they were the main gods worshipped by the ancient Greeks. The story of the battle between the Olympian gods and the Titans is known as the Titanomachy. Homer was another very famous ancient Greek poet who told stories, and hymns were attributed to him that had information about the gods and goddesses. He was one of the first to describe the gods and tell their stories connected to the Trojan War. Traditionally, he was regarded as blind as well. He had two main works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad was set during the Trojan War. It focuses on a feud, though, between the Greek hero Achilles and King Agamemnon. And it also focuses on Achilles' rivalry with the Trojan hero Hector. The Odyssey is set after the Trojan War. It chronicles the decades-long journey home of the Greek hero Odysseus. The Homeric hymns were probably written a little bit later, but they were attributed to Homer, and they were written in the same meter as his epic poems. They contain songs of praise to the Olympian gods, and they're an important source for ancient Greek religion. The Trojan War begins or originates in an event called the Judgment of Paris. There was a wedding between two famous Greeks, Peleus and Thetis, the parents of the Greek hero Achilles. Well, later parents, after they were married. The goddess Eris was not invited to the wedding, however, so she got angry and decided to cause chaos by throwing a golden apple into the wedding party that was inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," i.e. the most beautiful. She knew that this would cause jealousy and dispute among the goddesses. Sure enough, the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all claimed the apple as theirs, and they asked Paris, Prince of Troy, to judge who was the fairest. Aphrodite won, but only because she bribed Paris, saying that if he chose her, he could have the most beautiful woman in the world as his bride. So he gave her the golden apple, and the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen. Trouble was, Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. So Paris goes back to Troy with Helen in tow, and Menelaus is angry. He gets his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and all the other Greeks to rise up with him to go to war against Troy to get his wife Helen back. And there were many Greek heroes and kings. Achilles was regarded as the greatest of the Greek warriors. Hector was regarded as the greatest of the Trojan warriors. And another important character was Priam, the king of Troy. And the gods got involved on both sides of this conflict. For example, Athena supported the Greeks, whereas Aphrodite supported the Trojans. The Odyssey is the story of the long voyage home of Odysseus, a Greek hero after the Trojan War. He was the king of Ithaca, and he was regarded as a wise and crafty strategist. He came up with the stratagem of the Trojan horse, whereby the Greek soldiers hid in this large wooden horse and presented it as an offering to the Trojans. When they took it into the city, the Greeks then snuck out of the horse and looted the city. Penelope was the wife of Odysseus. Telemachus was his son. The reason why it took him so long to get home is he stopped off at this island that had these one-eyed giants or cyclops, and he ended up blinding one of them named Polyphemus. But he bragged about his deed as he was sailing away, and Polyphemus asked his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus, Poseidon, god of the sea, and sure enough, it happened. He went on many, many adventures. We can't go through all of them. These were important stories for ancient Greek myth and religion. In one of the stories, he was passing by the sirens, monstrous female birds whose voice would drive men wild with desire, and they would want to go towards the singing where they'd be devoured by the sirens. But Odysseus wanted to hear the singing without suffering that fate, so he had his men stuff up their ears with wax. His ears were not stuffed with wax, but he was tied fast to the central mast, as you can see in his vase painting in the picture. So even though he wanted to burst free and go to the sirens, he wasn't able to do so. Later on, he and his men sailed through Scylla and Charybdis, two monsters through which he had to navigate. So it was basically like each one was a threat, and he had to go in between them and get destroyed by neither. He was bewitched by Circe, who turned his men into swine, and later on he was held captive by the nymph or spirit Calypso for many years before he was able to get home and get rid of all the suitors who were trying to marry his wife Penelope. There are many gods and goddesses in ancient Greek religion. The Greek word theos meant God. The 12 Olympians, though, were usually the most important. Zeus was king of the gods and god of thunder and lightning. Hera was the wife of Zeus and goddess of mothers and childbirth. Aphrodite was the goddess of beauty, love, and fertility. Ares was the god of war. Athena was the goddess of weaving and crafts, wisdom, and war. Poseidon was the god of the sea, horses, and earthquakes. Artemis was goddess of the hunt, archery, maidenhood, and the moon. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, god of thieves, and a psychopomp or guide for souls. Hephaestus was the god of smithing. Demeter was goddess of grain. Apollo was god of poetry, prophecy, archery, and later the sun. And Dionysus was god of wine. There were other gods as well. Hestia was goddess of the hearth. Sometimes she was counted as one of the 12 Olympians in place of Dionysus. Hades was god of death, the land of the dead, and wealth. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter and the wife of Hades. She was the goddess of death and fertility. Hercules, or Heracles in Greek, was the son of Zeus and a demigod of strength. Pan was the god of nature and wild places. Asclepius was the divine physician. And Cybele was a fertility goddess originally worshipped in Asia Minor, or what's now Turkey. Festivals were very important in ancient Greece, particularly the Pan-Hellenic Games. These were festivals that featured games or sports that were attended by Greeks of different states. So that's why they were called Pan-Hellenic, or all the Greeks. Each focused on a sanctuary dedicated to a particular god. The Pythian games were at Delphi in honor of the god Apollo, who had an important oracle there. The Isthmian games were at Corinth in honor of the god Poseidon. The Nemean games were at Argos in honor of Zeus and Heracles. The Olympic games were at Olympia in honor of Zeus and Hera. There was also a separate Heraean games that were women only and prior to the men's events during the Olympics. And then the Pan-Athenaea at Athens was another festival in honor of the goddess Athena, patron of the city. It featured games, ceremonies, and a procession to the Acropolis, or high part of the city, that had the main temple to Athena. An epithet is a specific name for a god that indicates a function, locale, or cult. And oracles would often tell cities to add a new cult to a god under a particular epithet, and this might be necessary to avert some catastrophe like a plague. So these are examples of epithets of Apollo. Phoebus, or bright Apollo, was Apollo as the god of light. Apollo Smintheus, or mouse, was Apollo as the god of plagues. Apollo Apotropaeus was the god who averts plagues. Apollo Iatros, or healer, was the god of physicians. Apollo Pythios, or Delphinos, was the god of the oracle of Delphi, who was called the Pythia. And Apollo Delios was god of the oracle at the island of Delos. Athena also had several epithets associated with different parts of the city of Athens where she was worshipped. Athenia Polias, or of the city, referred to her as worshipped in her sanctuary on the Acropolis, or high part of the city. Athena Ergane, or crafts, was Athena associated with the agora, or marketplace. Athena Sotera, or savior, was her shrine in the Piraeus, or port. Greeks believed in many types of spirits. The general word for spirit was daimon. Nymphs were very common nature spirits, always female. Naiads were nymphs of fresh water. Nereids were sea nymphs, and they were the 50 daughters of Nereus, the old man of the sea, and of the Oceanid, or Oceanid, Doris. Oceanids were the 3,000 daughters of the Titans, Oceanus and Tethys. A dryad was a tree nymph of an oak tree specifically. A meliad was a nymph of an ash tree, and oreads were mountain nymphs. There were also male nature spirits, satyrs, usually depicted with goat legs. And another example was the Erinyes, or Furies, which were agents of divine vengeance. The gods would send them down to punish wrongdoers. The Greeks practiced many forms of divination. A mantic was a seer, and they would practice divination either for individuals or for local communities. There were also the oracles, or divinely inspired seers, and these would be visited by Greeks from all across the Greek-speaking world. The most famous was the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, who is shown in the painting on the right. This oracle was active all the way from the 7th century BC to the 4th century AD, so over 1,000 years. Petitioners would pay a fee to line up with a sacrificial goat, and then a priest would come by sprinkling water on their goat. If the goat shook off the water, that meant the petitioner could ask their question to Apollo, otherwise they're out of luck. The Pythia was a female oracle through whom Apollo would speak and answer questions. They sat in the Adaiton, or the inaccessible. This epithet of Apollo, Apolloloxios, or ambiguous, was a reference to the fact that the oracle's answer would often be difficult to understand, or even deliberately paradoxical. Plutarch was a Delphian priest who lived during the Roman era, 45 to 120 AD, and he said that Apollo's intention with this oracle was neither to conceal nor to reveal, but to intimate. He also criticized trivial questions that people would ask the oracle, such as, should I get married? Although there were other oracles that specialized in that kind of thing. One of the most famous sayings of the oracle that was posted at the site was Gnoti se auton, know thyself. Among other things, the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates interpreted this as a kind of duty for humans to understand themselves or to explore their soul, you might say. Other oracles of ancient Greece included the Oracle of Apollo at Didyma. Alexander the Great initiated the expansion of this temple and made it the largest one in Greece. Individuals would often come to the oracle with personal questions like, should I marry? Should I take a particular voyage? Or is it really my child? The Roman Emperor Diocletian, in the 3rd century AD, asked the oracle whether he should campaign against the Christians, and he received what he interpreted as an encouraging response. There was also the oracle of Apollo at Claros. One questioner asked the nature of God, and the oracle's response became famous. Quote, self-born, untaught, motherless, unshakable, giving place to no name, many-named, dwelling in fire. Such is God. We are a portion of God, his angels. End quote. Women played an important role in ancient Greek religion. It was a highly patriarchal society. Women were excluded from political participation, and the main work they were allowed to do was fetching water, preparing food, and weaving. But they did play a prominent role in Greek religion. There were many priestesses, just as numerous as priests, and women would often pray, perform at festivals, and they often paid for sacrifices to be done on their behalf and made dedications at temples. A very famous festival involving women was the Thesmophoria festival, honoring Demeter and her daughter Persephone. So Persephone was famously or infamously kidnapped by the god of the underworld, Hades, and taken away against her consent to live with him as his wife. And this festival kind of reenacted and commemorated that myth. The Thesmophoria in Athens would have each deme or district select 2 women as representatives, and the women governed the city briefly during the festival, at least ceremonially. The first day of the festival featured a procession from Athens to the nearby city of Eleusis, which was also the site of mystery religion. Women would bear tablets of the law. In the evening, they would participate in the Eleusinian mysteries. On the second day, women would fast and reenact Demeter's mourning for Persephone's abduction by Hades. Day 3 would see a blood sacrifice consecrated to Demeter as Kalagenia, or she who gives birth to beautiful children. The Greeks had many views about death and the afterlife. They thought of fate as being decided by the Moirai, or fates, which spun, measured, and cut the thread of life. But they also thought that Zeus or Hermes would weigh the souls of the dead. The Greek word for soul, or psyche, was related to their view of the afterlife. They thought the soul would go to the underworld after death, where it would become a shade or a shadow of its former self. Hades, in addition to being the name of the god of the dead, was the name of the underworld or land of the dead, and it was ruled by Hades and his bride Persephone. The shades there would have an afterlife, but as mentioned previously, it was a sort of gloomy cave and not one that was described very pleasantly. It was not a hell or place of torment, but it was kind of dark and it was underground, so probably pretty dirty. Later on, there developed a belief of part of Hades that was a place of punishment for especially wicked people or gods. This was Tartarus. And another part of the underworld, Elysium, or the Elysian Fields, that were paradise, reserved for the lucky few. Mystery religions were a type of ancient Greek religion that offered a new view of the afterlife. Rather than a gloomy future in the underworld of Hades, there was a blessed banquet to be had with the gods and other initiated souls. The word mystery comes from Greek mustos, which means secret. So the mystery religions generally had secret teachings or rituals that they only revealed to full members of the religion. The Eleusinian mysteries were named after the city of Eleusis, which was near Athens. a day's journey away, essentially. These began quite early in the 8th century BC, and they didn't end until 396 AD, when Eleusis was sacked by invading Goths, a Germanic people who by that time had converted to Arian Christianity. Um, the term mustai was used by a lot of ancient Greek mystery to mean initiates, so people who were members of this type of cult or way of worshiping the gods. The Eleusinian mysteries also had the term epoptai, those who had gained knowledge of the unrepeatable secrets. And the secrecy was taken with great seriousness. It was meant to be punished by death if anyone ever divulged the secrets of the mysteries. In the Eleusinian mysteries, at the main festival, there would be a preliminary procession from Eleusis to Athens, the biggest nearby city, in which priestesses would carry objects sacred to the goddess Demeter, who is the goddess of grain and fertility, in containers tied with red ribbons. The Eleusinian mysteries were especially connected to Demeter and her daughter Persephone, who is both a goddess of fertility but also the wife of Hades, god of the dead. So she also had associations with death and the afterlife. So then 5 days later, there'd be a parade from Athens to Eleusis, and the Mustai would fast in preparation for the mysteries, a series of ceremonies that night. There would be dancing, sacrifice of bulls, and then libations or liquid offerings poured out to the dead. The picture shows the part of the initiation ceremony into the Eleusinian mysteries. In addition to the standard customary Greek religion, you could say there were a lot of ancient Greek philosophers or writers who had an impact on the way some people thought about the gods. Their impact is probably greatest among the educated classes, but they also influenced later ancient religions coming out of Greece and other nearby cultures. Xenophanes, who lived from 560 to 478 BC, rejected an anthropomorphic view of the gods. And in other words, he didn't think of them as having a human form or human foibles. So he also conceived of the gods as being incapable of immorality. It just wasn't in their nature. Rather, he proposed a supreme universal god ruling over other gods and men. So he didn't necessarily explicitly deny that the Olympians or customary gods of Greek religion existed, but he proposed this new, more cosmic, all good, all wise, supreme universal God. These philosophers we're talking about on this slide are called pre-Socratics because they were before the time of Socrates, who was a very influential philosopher, and he ended up impacting some Greek religious beliefs too. But we'll get to Socrates in a moment. So Xenophanes, that general idea of the gods was very influential on other philosophers and later, other educated people and some particular sects. There was also the philosopher Heraclitus, who flourished around 500 BC. This is one of the quotations from him. Most of these philosophers, we don't have complete works of theirs, but they survive in quotations or literary fragments. Quote, "Wisdom is one thing, to understand the intelligence by which all things are steered through all things. It is willing and it is unwilling to be called by the name Zeus." Unquote. So, in other words, Heraclitus sees this divine wisdom governing the cosmos, and the word Zeus refers to the king of the gods in traditional Greek religion. So that's probably why Heraclitus thought that it was a fitting name or title for this divine wisdom. It's a ruling principle. And yet he seems hesitant to think that the word Zeus is a perfect description of this guiding intelligence. Hence, it's unwilling as well to be called by the name. Another quote from Heraclitus, quote, "God sees man the same way man sees children and apes," unquote. In other words, proposing that the divine intelligence is of a higher order than that of humans. And another quote is, "For God all things are fair and good and just, but men suppose that some are unjust and others just," unquote. Now, it can often be difficult to interpret the exact meaning of a lot of these literary fragments because the context is lost, among other things. But it does seem that Heraclitus thought there was a kind of divine providence governing the whole universe for the sake of the good, even if it's not visible to humans. The literary critic Theagenes of Rhegium, who flourished from 529 to 522 BC, advocated a allegorical interpretation of the gods in Homer's poems. In other words, he didn't insist that the gods actually existed the way they were believed in customary Greek religion. So Athena he interpreted as intellect, Ares, the god of war, as folly, and Aphrodite as desire. The philosopher Anaxagoras, who lived from around 500 to 428 BC, advocated belief in one divine mind or intellect. The Greek word is nous. Here's a quotation, quote, "All living things, both great and small, are controlled by mind," unquote. And you can see this general picture emerging. The philosophers, they disagreed with each other about pretty much everything, but there was a kind of common view that there was a divine intelligence sort of steering the cosmos. Protagoras was a teacher of rhetoric, and he was numbered among the sophists or wise men. Even though they were called wise in their title or customary name, they're actually criticized greatly by Socrates and Plato for leading people astray. But Protagoras was an agnostic, so he actually doubted the existence of the gods, as you can see in the following quotation. Quote, "Concerning the gods, I'm unable to discover whether they exist or not, or what they are in form, for there are many hindrances to knowledge, the obscurity of the subject, and the brevity of life," unquote. So some philosophers or thinkers like Protagoras didn't have any views about the gods or thought that they couldn't be known, or maybe even that they didn't exist. There were other philosophers who did believe in something divine, but their views often contrasted with that of customary Greek religion. So most philosophers did not believe in all the myths or stories about the Olympian gods. Critias was an Athenian playwright who lived from 460 to 403 BC, and he may have been an atheist. Here's a quotation, quote, "I believe that a man of shrewd and subtle mind invented for men the fear of gods, so that there might be something to frighten the wicked even if they acted, spoke, or thought in secret," unquote. And that's a common view you see not only nowadays, but also in antiquity, that religion exists as a way of trying to police morality, put the fear in people even when they can't be punished or seen by other humans. Another very important early Greek philosopher, he was kind of a cult leader as well, Pythagoras. He was living from around 570 to 495 BC. So his followers were a kind of religious-like sect, but they also did philosophy and mathematics. But he had two teachings that were very impactful on later Greek religion. First, he taught that the soul was immortal, so it's indestructible and it will have some kind of robust post-mortem existence. He also believed in reincarnation, so that people could be reincarnated to other human bodies or animal bodies, and that would be based on their actions in their previous life. Socrates was a very famous Greek philosopher, not the first, but he was one of the first to try to deal systematically with questions of ethics and politics, as opposed to mainly focusing on natural philosophy. So he lived from around 470 to 399 BC, and he was from Athens. So Socrates, even though he had a reputation for going around questioning everything, he really questioned people to sort of test their wisdom, test their knowledge, see if they actually knew the things that they thought they knew. So he was actually eventually put to death for corrupting the youth and for impiety. Partly it's because he angered a lot of people in power by questioning them so much. But he actually regarded himself as very pious, as a devotee of the god of Apollo, specifically from the shrine at Delphi. He tells the story in his apology or legal defense when he's on trial for corrupting the youth, that a friend of his went to the oracle and asked, "Is there anyone wiser than Socrates?" And the oracle said, "No, there's none wiser." When his friend told him the story, though, Socrates was very puzzled because even though he had a lot of philosophical questions, he knew they didn't have the answers. So he decided to try to test the oracle to see if the oracle was telling the truth by questioning the various classes and prominent people in society, such as priests, poets, who were very culturally influential in ancient Greece, politicians, craftsmen. So he would just go around spending a lot of his days questioning people and trying to see if they had any wisdom. He also claimed to receive messages from a daimon or spirit that he connected with the god Apollo. In Socrates' view, Apollo appears to be mainly a god of wisdom and knowledge. That was the aspect of Apollo that Socrates was particularly interested in. And the daimon wouldn't tell Socrates answers to questions, but it would give him a kind of intuition or sign that he had said something wrong. So it sort of told him what not to do or what not to say. So eventually, after questioning everyone, he did find that they had the pretense to knowledge. He actually admired the craftsmen the most because at least they knew their trades. But in all of these people, they claimed to know things that they didn't actually know because their answers fell apart upon Socrates' examinations. But eventually he realized that he was in a way wiser than the others, and the way he put it is that that man is wise who, like Socrates, knows that he knows nothing. That was Socrates' interpretation of the god Apollo's oracle. So he also did have some views. He did have some things that either he believed that he knew or that he at least strongly suspected were the case. So, for example, he questioned the views that the gods could do anything immoral, as they were typically depicted doing in ancient Greek myths. So he agreed with Xenophanes in that respect, that the nature of the divine is to be moral and wise. So he thought that the gods had the true wisdom or the highest wisdom, but he thought there was a human kind of wisdom that humans could also realistically strive for and search for. That included knowing what you didn't know or the limitations of your knowledge. But yeah, eventually he was actually put to death for corrupting the youth and for impiety. These were partially trumped up charges, but also he was very critical, even critical of the jury when he was on trial. And so probably he ended up angering some of them and they sentenced him to death. And he eventually drank the poison that was given to him, which is a inspiration for another very famous dialogue of one of his followers, Plato. So Plato was one of the people inspired by Socrates. There were others too. For example, Xenophanes was an Athenian who was a warrior and a writer, and he wrote some texts that described Socrates doing philosophy. He also has a different version of Socrates' Apology or Final Legal Defense. There are many philosophers inspired by the example of Socrates because basically he lived out his philosophy even to the point of death. And his philosophy also had views about the gods and the soul. Plato took some of Socrates' ideas and kind of developed them. And unlike Socrates, who was mainly conscious of the limits of his knowledge, what he didn't know, Plato, through his dialogues, articulated a lot of different theories, a lot of different claims. And in addition to being influenced by Socrates, he was greatly influenced by Pythagoras. So, for example, Plato believed, like Pythagoras, that the soul was immortal. And he also seems to have believed in reincarnation. So, a lot of these philosophical principles of Plato ended up influencing later Greek and some other religions as well. Plato believed that knowledge and being were only possible in our world of matter and sense perception through these eternal, immutable principles, which he called the forms or the ideas. So the Greek word for form is morphe, it literally means shape, and the word for idea, basically had a similar meaning to the English word, but it was something that was not necessarily seen. It was more of a thought. But he used both to describe these eternal, immutable principles. The word form, not because they had a literal physical shape, but because they had a certain logical shape or structure. And so he thought that we could only know things in our world that's always changing and that gives us limited information from fallible senses. Genuine knowledge would only be possible by something that is not changing and that was always the same and that could be known with certainty. So those were the forms or the ideas. And basically, we can only know things in our material world and using our senses to approximation, whereas the forms you could know exactly. And he also thought of the forms themselves as having a prior principle through which they are known and which also gives them their being. He called this the good. So this is the cause of the forms and thus the first principle of all being and coming to be or becoming. Plato's soul theory was also very important for his philosophy. He thought of souls as being like the forms in that they are immutable and unchanging, and also not directly perceptible to the senses. An impure soul would be reincarnated into a new material body, whether human or animal. But a pure soul would be able to transcend the material world after death and basically ascend to the realm of the forms, these eternal principles, which either were the stars and heavenly bodies or were at least symbolized or associated with them. If you think about the stars and heavenly bodies, they don't change that much, at least over the course of a human lifespan. So they're a fitting symbol for the unchanging, at least compared to things closer to us, which tend to die and change much more quickly. And so the soul would actually be linked in Plato's view to one of the stars in the heavens. And so it kind of ascends to that world. And he thought of philosophy as getting people less attached to material things and the sort of limited knowledge based on the senses, the approximate knowledge or the opinion, and thus as getting closer and closer to the world of the forms. So this is a very dualistic philosophy. There's two kinds of being. The eternal forms, which are unchanging, kind of pure or perfect, and can be known perfectly as well, versus the material world, which is the opposite of all those. Matter does participate in the forms, so it kind of resembles them to a greater or lesser degree, and that's how we can have limited or approximate knowledge of matter. Like an example of this would be a triangular object made of matter is not going to be a perfect geometric triangle. Our geometric idea of the triangle would be like a form, whereas the triangular object may have a slightly unstraight side, for example, or it might bend slightly in 3 dimensions and not be a perfectly two-dimensional figure. So we would only know the material object approximately based on our knowledge of the kind of rational ideal. But nevertheless, there are resemblances or degrees of participation between material objects and the forms. He also had an account of the creation involving a demiurge or divine craftsman who makes the material universe by shaping the imperfect, impure matter in imitation of the forms. And so the material world is inherently limited by the limitations of matter, and the demiurge basically does his best, you could say, given the flawed materials that he has. And this is explained in his dialogue to Timaeus. So Plato also gives a version of the cosmological proof for the existence of God. Plato, he uses the word the good to talk about the first principle of being. So it's basically his version or equivalent of God, although it's not clear that he thinks of it as a conscious or personal being, the way people would usually think of gods. But he says that God exists because the heavens are observed to move in an orderly fashion. So there's regular motions of the planets and stars, and only God can be the cause of an orderly motion. God animates the heavens just as the soul animates a living body. That's an argument by analogy. But he was a great critic of customary Greek religion, like Socrates and a lot of other philosophers before him. He even thought that the poems of Homer and other poets were often dangerous because they portrayed the gods, who are beings that are supposed to be worthy of worship, but they often portrayed the gods being jealous or excessively angry or otherwise behaving in an immoral fashion. So his ideal form of religion would indeed be sponsored by the polis or the city-state, but it would only involve hymns of praise to the good. And so he was a great critic of the ancient Greek religion, but he still advocated this kind of more idealized or philosophical religion. And he didn't like atheism. He thought they actually, the atheists should get the death penalty. So the Stoic philosophers were another group influenced by Socrates. They were also influenced by some earlier philosophers called the Cynics, like Diogenes the Cynic, who tried to live in accordance with nature. The Cynics were kind of radical. They would reject a lot of human customs, like Diogenes lived in a large vessel that was turned on its side. This is basically like an ancient Greek shipping container, but it would be much smaller. And he only tried to do things that he thought were justified by the natural world and human nature, what humans needed to survive, as opposed to human customs. The Stoics liked that idea of living in accordance with nature, but they were much less radical about it than the Cynics, and they thought that human custom was a part of human nature, and so they followed norms and moral rules and other customs of society. The Stoics' main religious idea was that a divine logos, word or reason, governed the cosmos. So this was not their invention, but they developed the thinking of that and really spread it throughout the Greek and later the Roman world. An example of a Stoic philosopher is Cleanthes, who lived from 331 to 230 BC. He's famous for his Stoic hymn to Zeus, and they used the name of the Greek king of the gods as a kind of title of this divine logos. So he praises in the hymn the universal dominion of an omniscient, all-knowing God who dispenses cosmic justice. And so that way of thinking was not the original ancient Greek view, but it influenced a lot of later Greeks and Romans. Later Greek religion was more various. One custom that developed after the time of Alexander the Great was some kings or emperors declaring themselves gods, or they could be declared gods posthumously. And so there was a kind of cult of the emperor or the king, which was often used to try to make people loyal to a dynasty. And later on, kingdoms that were larger in size took the place of the earlier independent city-states. So Athens and Sparta, for example, were conquered by Alexander the Great, and his large empire broke up, but it was divided into large kingdoms that were composed of multiple city-states. The traditional Greek religion and oracles and games continued, but mystery religions and foreign religions also grew in popularity. There were also new state-sponsored cults of gods like Nike or Victory and Tuke or Fortune. And oftentimes, rulers and others would be regarded as a savior or soter. This trend seems to have been more common from the 3rd century BC on, really probably the later 4th century BC and onward. Section 2.7, Roman religion. Rome had a lot of myths about its early history and founding, and these were basically a part of their religion. According to tradition, the city of Rome goes back to these twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. They were born in the town of Alba Longa, which was in Italy, but it was not Rome. Their mother was a Vestal Virgin, so she was a priestess of the goddess Vesta, which was the Roman name for the goddess of the hearth. So their mother was Rhea Silvia, and she was a daughter of the king of Alba Longa, King Numitor. And her father was the god Mars, the Roman god of war. And according to Roman belief, the Romulus and Remus twins were actually distant descendants of Aeneas, one of the heroes of Trojan War, but he was fighting on behalf of the Trojans. So the Romans always identified more with the Trojans, even though they accepted the Greek stories about the Trojan War. They identified more with Troy than with the ancient Greeks. So when they were young, Romulus and Remus were condemned to death by another king, King Amulius, who had taken over power from their grandfather, King Numitor. And so they were meant to be sentenced to death, but they were just abandoned on the bank of the Tiber River, which is one of the rivers in Italy. It flows through Rome. They were saved partly through the intercession of the river god Tiberinus, and then they were suckled by a she-wolf in a cave called the Lupercal. And the picture on the slide called the Capitoline Wolf is a famous sculpture of Romulus and Remus being suckled by the she-wolf. They were eventually adopted by the human shepherd Faustulus and raised by him. Eventually, they came of age, and they joined forces with their grandfather Numitor to restore him to the throne of Alba Longa and defeat King Amulius. Later, they went on to found the city of Rome. They left Alba Longa to establish their own city near 7 hills. And these 7 hills were part of ancient Rome, still part of Rome today. But they disagreed upon which hill they should found their city. Romulus wanted to found the city on the Palatine Hill, and Remus on the Aventine Hill. They performed an augury or divination to determine who would win. Remus saw 6 birds flying, but Romulus saw 12. But they disagreed about how to interpret the result of the augury, and Romulus ended up killing his brother Remus. Romulus founded the city of Rome on the Palatine Hill and ruled it as its first king, and according to their belief, he established many of its institutions. Another incident in the early history of Rome was when Romulus and his followers, who were men basically from the surrounding countryside, abducted women of the neighboring Sabine tribe and killed their men. So they did this to help populate the city of Rome. And this is called the rape of the Sabine women. So a lot of the early history of Rome, it's legendary, including some of the early kings. But according to tradition, Tarquin the Proud, who died around 495 BC, was the seventh and final king of Rome. And after him was the Roman Republic. So the Roman Republic was governed by a senate or a assembly of elder men, who would make a lot of the important decisions for the city. And they had a lot of other government officials who wielded various types of power as well. The Roman Republic lasted from 509 to 27 BC. So it was there all throughout the early centuries of Rome, including its rise to power throughout the Mediterranean. One of the features of the Roman Republic was this political conflict called the conflict of the orders. It was basically the patricians or noble class who had a lot of land versus the plebeians or common people. Eventually, that conflict subsided, and that was even before the establishment of the Roman Empire. So there were a lot of other kingdoms and peoples around Rome. Rome was initially not very powerful in Italy. To the north was this older civilization of Etruria. They spoke a non-Indo-European language, and they had a very developed culture with a lot of art, funerary customs. So they're known as the Etruscans. There were other peoples related linguistically to the Romans who spoke Indo-European languages in other parts of Italy, but they were kind of like in the cultural buffer zone between the other Italic peoples and kingdoms in the south and the Etruscans to the north. It was a bit more complicated than that geographically, but partly because they were on that linguistic and cultural frontier, they had to be tough and survive a lot of invasions, and so they eventually grew in military power because of their solidarity. Later, after they started to dominate all of Italy, they came into conflict with another power across the sea, across the Mediterranean Sea. That was Carthage. That was a kingdom in North Africa founded by Phoenicians, settlers from Phoenicia, from the eastern Mediterranean. And that was Rome's main rival as they started to expand throughout the western Mediterranean. They fought a series of wars with Carthage. Eventually, they defeated them, destroyed Carthage utterly. And when they conquered Africa, which was a great source of grain for them until the end of the Western Roman Empire, they really became a dominant power eventually throughout the whole Mediterranean. The Roman Republic ended primarily with Julius Caesar, who was the first of the emperors. He kind of set up the imperial system of government in part to help some crises to help solve the later Roman Republic. He was very controversial. He was actually assassinated by many of the senators, but his successor, Augustus, firmly established the imperial system of government, which continued up until the end of the Roman Empire. So the Romans had many gods and goddesses. A lot of them were similar to the gods of the Greeks, and some of them were just kind of associated later with the gods of the Greeks. Especially after the Romans conquered Greece, they just imported a lot of Greek myths and kind of assimilated them into their own culture. And part of that process was associating some of their gods with the Greek gods. Saturn in Roman belief was the first ruler of the gods, and he ruled in a golden age. So he was associated with the Greek Titan Cronus, although this association was a bit looser than some of the others, just because the Roman god Saturn didn't really have the same negative associations, at least initially, as the Greek god Cronus, who had devoured his children. But Saturn was the father of the other main Roman gods, including Jupiter, Neptune, Pluto, Juno, Ceres, and Vesta. Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto were a kind of triad because Jupiter ruled the sky, Neptune ruled the sea, and Pluto ruled the earth. So Jupiter was the god of thunder and king of the gods. So he was king after Saturn. Juno was his wife. She was a goddess of motherhood, similar to the Greek god Hera. Neptune was god of the sea, similar to the Greek god Poseidon. Pluto was the god of the dead. He was also associated with wealth and fertility. And he was the equivalent of the Greek god Hades. Venus was the Roman goddess of love. She was associated with the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Mars was the Roman god of war. He was associated with the Greek god Ares. Minerva was the goddess of weaving, and she was associated with the Greek goddess Athena. Diana was the Roman goddess of the hunt, and she was associated with the Greek goddess Artemis. Mercury was the god of trade, travel, and messengers. He was associated with Hermes. Vulcan was the Roman god of smithing. He was associated with Hephaestus. Ceres was the goddess of grain. We get the word cereal from it, and her name, and she was associated with the Greek goddess Demeter. Proserpina was a fertility goddess associated with the Greek goddess Persephone, basically just the Roman version of Persephone. Vesta was the Roman goddess of the hearth, and she was associated with the Greek goddess Hestia. And Janus was the Roman god of doorways, and he famously had two faces because doorways face in two directions. Romans also believed in many spirits. They used the word genius to name a spirit associated typically with a particular person or a place. For example, genius loci would be a spirit of a place. There are also the lares or guardian deities, the daemones or spirits of the dead ancestors. Romans would keep skulls or later just portrait busts of their ancestors in their homes, so they kind of had a cult of worshiping them, remembering them. There was also belief in lemures or ghosts and dei familiares or household gods. An example was the dei penates, household gods associated with the hearth and with food. In the picture is a lararium, or a household shrine for the lares, guardian deities. This is one from Pompeii. There were many types of oracles and clergy in ancient Rome. The augur was a public official who performed divination, usually based on the flight of birds or other signs as well. And they might decide things, for example, like when or whether to fight an enemy in battle. The Vestal Virgins were six maidens dedicated to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. They had to maintain their maidenhood on pain of death, and there were some that were sentenced to death in ancient times. They tended the sacred fire in the temple to Vesta to ensure it never died. And this was basically regarded as the hearth of the city, symbolically. They also prepared a special flour that was sprinkled on sacrificial animals. Animal sacrifice was a big part of Roman religion, like many other ancient religions. They also safeguarded wills and important state documents, which they stored in their temple. They were important in the Parentalia festival that honored ancestors, and in Vestalia, which were 8 days in the month of June, there were women from the city who helped the Vestal Virgins prepare the sacred flour for use in the later sacrifices. There was also the general title of pontifex or priest. In ancient Rome, this would often be a title that someone would hold temporarily or as part of their cursus honorium, or rise through various political positions of influence. So it was at least partly a political position as well as a religious position. The Pontifex Maximus was the high priest of Rome, and one of their duties was to whip any Vestal Virgin whose neglect caused the sacred fire to die out. There were many, many festivals celebrated in ancient Rome, so we're just going to go through a few of the highlights or some of the more well-known ones. Parentalia was a festival from February 13 to 22nd, and it honored the dead ancestors. By the way, the modern calendar used in our culture is mostly derived from that of Rome, so the months had the same names. Lupercalia was a festival on February the 15th, which was characterized by the Luperci, or Brothers of the Wolf, who were special priests who sacrificed goats and a dog at the Lupercal cave, where Romulus and Remus had been suckled by the she-wolf. Lemuria was the festival celebrated on May 9th, 11th, and 13th, and it involved the exorcism of ghosts and other troublesome spirits of the dead with chants and with offerings of black beans. So a lot of these festivals had very particular customs associated with them. Vestalia was the festival from June 7th to 15th, which honored the goddess Vesta. The Ludi Romani, or Roman Games, were celebrated from the September 5th to the 19th. This was a religious festival with games similar to the ancient Greek Olympic and other games, and theatrical performances. And there were actually many games throughout the year, throughout the Roman calendar. The priests would keep track of the calendar and thus of the festivals. The Ludi Plebii was celebrated from November 4th to 17th. This was a festival with games and theatrical performances for the common people, or the plebeians. And then Saturnalia was celebrated from December 17th to 23rd in honor of the god Saturn. Among other things, people would play dice. You can see a picture of that on the slide, and wear masks. So this was more of a time of merriment and revelry rather than a solemn festival. Octavian Julius Caesar, or Augustus, was the successor to Julius Caesar. He was his adopted son. He was able to secure his rule in Rome and then defeated his chief rival, Mark Antony, who had fled to Egypt and formed an alliance with Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt. And he conquered Egypt as well and thus added it to the Roman Empire. He claimed that 12 vultures had appeared to him, just as they had appeared to Romulus before he founded Rome. So the idea of augury or divination by the flight of birds was a very important part of Roman culture and religion. So his clan, by adoption, the Julians, had claimed descent from Aeneas and Venus. And you can see in the sculpture of Augustus on the right, there's a small depiction of Cupid, who was the son of Venus, or goddess of love, and he was connected to desire or lust. So, among other things, Augustus patronized Virgil, a famous poet, to write the Aeneid. So this was an epic poem that was kind of the Roman equivalent of Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, but it traces the foundation of Rome from Aeneas fleeing Troy, have many adventurers as he sails to Italy and then founds the city. Augustus also served as Pontifex Maximus, or high priest, and that's an illustration of how oftentimes politicians would take on priestly functions as well. He even brought the Vestal hearth into his own home to symbolize that his rule was the new sacred center of the city. His title Augustus meant blessed or fortunate, and it was used by later Roman emperors after him. So he also started the imperial cult, in which sacrifices would be offered to his genius, his spirit or essence, and his numen or divine power. He was elevated to divine status after his death in 14 AD, and that was also continued for several other later Roman emperors. According to his widow, a senator had claimed that he had seen Augustus ascend to heaven, so that was one of the justifications for treating him as a god. Well, this was not really according to his widow, but at his widow's prompting, because she paid that senator a bribe. So it shows this idea that money was often used to help authenticate miracles, but there was an idea that there had to be some miracle as proof of the divinity of the emperor. So there are also a lot of ancient Roman writers who shaped religious beliefs. Virgil in his Aeneid talked about Aeneas, the founding of Rome, and mentioned a lot of the gods and goddesses in Roman religion. He presented Aeneas, though, in a bit of an ambivalent light. So this was a work that was supposed to be used for kind of political propaganda purposes. At least that was probably Augustus's idea. But Virgil was very much more subtle in his and complex in his depiction of the story. Ovid was a famous Roman poet. One of his works, the Metamorphoses, was a retelling of all the Greek and Roman myths. And it included unflattering portrayals of especially the male gods' use of violence. Some of its favorable portrayals included of the foreign goddess Isis, who was from Egypt. And he had praise for some other religious figures as well, like Pythagoras. He was forced into exile by Augustus. We don't actually know the reason why, but he eventually died in exile. Varro was a Roman writer who lived from 116 to 27 BC, and in his Human and Divine Antiquities, he created a collection of Roman religious practices. So that word antiquity would often be used to refer to ancient customs or ceremonies. So he also identified three theologiae, or ways of thinking about the gods: the mythical, the philosophical, and the civic or practical. So the mythical would include like the traditional stories, the philosophical would be a more rational take on the nature of the gods, and the civic or practical would include the customs and ceremonies performed by cities, usually involving like public processions and things where the citizens would take part. The Roman writer Cicero was skeptical of many traditional religious beliefs, but he did advocate a form of traditional civic religion in his work, The Laws. He also wrote a work called De Natura Deorum, or On the Nature of the Gods, which was a dialogue between different philosophers, Epicureans, the Stoics, and the academic skeptics, each with their own take on the gods. The Stoics didn't accept the customary or mythic version of the gods, but they believed in a divine providence. The Epicureans actually believed in the gods, but they just thought of them as blessed beings who didn't respond to human prayers or interact with them, so they were kind of irrelevant for human purposes, except as kind of ideal role models on how to have a happy life. The academic skeptics were actually later scholars of Plato's Academy who thought that knowledge was impossible. So they were kind of more Socratic in their orientation. They didn't accept all of Plato's doctrines about the good or how you would know about the divine. So the later Romans also worshipped many foreign gods. One example is Magna Mater, or the Great Mother, which was the Roman name for Cybele, which was a fertility goddess from Asia Minor. The Sibylline Oracle, which is one of the most important oracles for the ancient Romans, had prophesied that Rome would defeat their enemy Carthage if it imported the worship of Cybele, so they did so, including the transport of a black meteorite that was believed to be sacred to the goddess Cybele. This happened in 204 BC. Also, the Greek god Apollo, who was not originally a part of Roman religion, was adopted. They instituted games in his honor as part of the calendar in 212 BC. The Greek goddess Demeter, goddess of grain, and her Thesmophoria festival, which was associated with the Eleusinian mysteries, was introduced as well in 205 BC. Another Greek god was Dionysus, who's called Bacchus in Roman religion, and they imported his worship around 200 BC. The Bacchanalia was a secret nocturnal ritual that promised emotional release for its participants. It was popular among women and slaves, and it became later somewhat controversial. It was charged with conspiring against the Roman state in 186 BC. 7,000 Bacchantes, or followers of Bacchus, were arrested and many were executed. Also, the Greek god Asclepius, the god of healing and doctors, his worship became popular later as well. Later Roman religion incorporated beliefs from other cultures. Serapis became popular at one point. It was a god that originated in Egypt when it was under Greek rule during the Ptolemaic dynasty. So it was a syncretic Greek/Egyptian god that combined aspects of the two Egyptian gods, Apis and Osiris. The worship of Serapis was popularized in the 3rd century BC by Ptolemy I Soter, and it became an important part of later Egyptian paganism. Mithraism was the cult of the god Mithras. This was originally an Iranian or Persian deity, but the form that reached Rome was Hellenized, or really transformed by the Greek culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so a lot of the imagery and rituals were not at all those used with the God's worship in Persia. So it was a type of mystery religion. You could be initiated into 7 grades of increasing secrecy and knowledge. It was popular in the Roman army in the 1st to 4th centuries AD, and some of its rituals apparently influenced those used by later Freemasonry and just other kind of occult traditions or fraternal organizations where they have initiation ceremonies with different grades and ranks. That may have been one of the reasons why it was popular among the Roman army. It was kind of like a common set of ceremonies they could participate in, regardless of where they were stationed throughout the empire. Neoplatonism is a term used by modern scholars to refer to late Platonism from the 4th and later centuries. and it emphasized mystical union with the One, and later Neoplatonists emphasized theurgy, or rituals honoring the form's eternal principles as godlike beings. So Plotinus was the one who started this tradition, and his ideal was for the human soul to rise or ascend to the level of the One, which was his term, the term he usually used for Plato's good, the source of all being and coming to be. So a lot of the more educated later pagans in the Roman Empire were actually Neoplatonists. There were several sects, both Christian and others, that are often labeled Gnostic by scholars and just later people. The word Gnostic implies some kind of secret knowledge. Sometimes, so they were kind of like later versions of the mystery religions. They claimed to give secret or esoteric spiritual knowledge, gnosis, for salvation. The term is sometimes criticized because Gnosticism was not one thing and there was a variety of beliefs, but what they did have in common is this notion of a secret spiritual teaching that was not available to the many, but only to the few or to the elect. And so when it's used that way, the term is still useful. There were several sects of Christianity that were Gnostic in nature. And Christianity started to spread throughout the Roman Empire during and especially after the first century AD. So many of these later religions had savior or soter figures. The word soter is from Greek. And the mystery religions had promised a type of salvation in the form of a happy or blessed afterlife. And that was generally the function of the savior, although they could also perform blessings in this life as well. Later, there was also a cult of Rome, the city of Rome, which the word Roma in Greek meant power. So it was kind of adopted by some in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is more Greek speaking. And there was also a cult of Rome and Augustus, or the emperor. The Severan dynasty promoted the Syrian god Elagabal as well. So a lot of these later Roman rulers were promoting gods from other cultures. And the promotion by the ruler, they wouldn't require necessarily everyone to sacrifice to their favorite god, but just by paying for temples and priests, they could make the god more prominent in the culture. The Emperor Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 AD, sponsored worship of the god Sol Invictus, whose name means the unconquered sun. But by this time, Christianity was already starting to spread. The Roman Emperor Diocletian identified himself as the son of Jupiter, and he ruled from 284 to 305 AD. Roman religion came to an end as a result of the spread of Christianity from the 1st to the 4th centuries AD. The first Roman emperor to become a Christian, at least in devotion, was Constantine the Great, who ruled from 306 to 337 AD. He ended the empire's persecution of Christianity, which previously had been persecuted because it was regarded as a threat to Roman culture and religion, and Christians were also very suspicious because they would not sacrifice to the emperor, so they were regarded as potential rebels or threats to the regime. And Constantine formally converted to Christianity. I believe he wasn't baptized until his deathbed, but he definitely promoted Christianity even before his formal baptism. So that was kind of the turning point. Most of the emperors after him were Christian, and Christianity rapidly spread among the upper classes and eventually among the few remaining people in the countryside who had kept to the old ways. There was one later emperor who was not Christian. He's called Julian the Apostate by Christians, and he briefly restored the pagan religion, but by then paganism had already started to die out, and so the form that he promoted was kind of infused with Neoplatonist thinking as well. And he was the last pagan emperor of Rome, though. And pagan just refers to worshiping non-monotheistic religions, so not Christianity or Judaism or Islam, and includes most of the ancient religions of antiquity, like the Roman religion. Section 2.8, Iranian religion. The Iranians were basically an ethnic group that migrated to what's now Iran, called Persia in antiquity. There were other kingdoms in that general area, but once the Iranians settled there, they all spoke similar languages. And the Iranians were associated with the Aryans, an ancient ethnic group from Central Asia. Some of the Aryans migrated to India, where they gave rise to the Veda, the religion that is the basis for Hinduism. Others migrated to Persia, and those ones are called Iranians. The modern nation Iran is named after them. So Persia came to prominence through the establishment of the Achaemenid Empire, which lasted from 550 to 330 BC. This was an ancient Persian empire that conquered much of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, including Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and parts of Greece. Cyrus II, or the Great, was the founder of the empire, and he was from Persis. So that was um, the kingdom that was the sort of original focus of the empire, with its capital at Persepolis. He spoke Old Persian, that was the language of this dynasty, which was related to Old Avestan, the language associated with ancient Iranian religion. But Old Persian was from the southwest, unlike Old Avestan, which was from further to the east. So they were slightly different languages. A later Persian empire was that of the Parthians, or the Arsacids, and that lasted from 247 BC to 224 AD. The Achaemenid Empire had come to an end when it was conquered by Alexander the Great, and it was ruled by Greek kings after, but eventually a new Persian empire came into being with the Parthians. They were great rivals of the Roman Empire early in the history of Rome and throughout the imperial period. The Sasanian Empire was the successor to the Parthian Empire, and they lasted for several centuries, but they were eventually destroyed by Muslim armies invading from the west, and they were replaced by the Muslim Caliphate. Mithridates VI was an interesting king of Pontus. This was an ancient rival of the Roman Republic, but what's interesting about him is that he was of mixed Persian and Greek ancestry, and his reign kind of included aspects of both the Greek and the Persian culture and religion. Zoroastrianism is the most well-known form of ancient Persian religion. It's a religion based on the teachings of the prophet Zarathustra, who was called Zoroaster in ancient Greek. And it appears to have been supported by the Achaemenid Empire and by later Persian dynasties. Zarathustra was a prophet and reformer of the original or ancient form of the Persian religion. He spoke a language called Old Avestan. He lived probably in the eastern part of the Iranian plateau, closer to India than to Mesopotamia. We don't know exactly when he lived. Indeed, he may have been a legendary figure, just how some people say Moses, who was one of the main founders of Judaism, may have been legendary. He was in a similar time period and has kind of like a similar historical status to Zarathustra. But he lived sometime between 1500 and 500 BC, but probably before 1000 BC. He's believed to have authored some of the gathas, or poetic hymns, in Old Avestan that are part of the scriptures of Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrians have diverse body of scriptures, only some of which are ancient, only some of which go back to the time of Zarathustra. Many of them were written or at least compiled much later. So the ancient Avestan language is related to Sanskrit, the Indian language of the Veda. And that shows you the common ethnic origin of the Aryans who migrated to India and those who migrated to Iran or Persia and became the Iranians. Zarathustra probably lived closer to India or the Indus River than to Mesopotamia. So that's reflected in the linguistic relation between Sanskrit and Avestan. So the Avesta is a compilation of Zoroastrian teachings. It only received its canonical form in the 7th century AD, but it was compiled over 1,000-year or more period. So the oldest parts are ancient. And it was also revised in the 8th and 9th centuries after the Muslim conquest of Persia. So Yasna, which means worship, is the oldest text of the Avesta. It has 72 chapters divided into two parts, the Old Avestan part and Younger Avestan, based on the language in which it was written. So the Gathas are part of the Yasna, and there are 17 hymns in Old Avestan. Those are the ones attributed to Zarathustra himself. Yashts are part of the Avesta, but they're in Younger Avestan, and they're 21 hymns of veneration to several divinities. The Vendidad is part of the Avesta in Younger Avestan, and it's a collection of purity taboos. Zoroastrianism mainly focuses on worshiping one being, Ahura Mazda, but there are other divine beings mentioned in the Yashts. So certain versions of Zoroastrianism kind of have this like pantheon of lesser deities. You could also compare them to angels in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. One of the main theological principles of Zoroastrianism is dualism. There's a cosmic conflict between a good divine being and an evil being. Ahura Mazda is the name Zarathustra gave for the good God, which means wise Lord. Ahura is a term that implies a god, it implies creative power. It's actually related to the Sanskrit word asura, which we see in the Rig Veda, the oldest part of the Hindu scriptures, which refers to a type of divinity. Later in Hinduism, the word asura is used to refer to demonic enemies of the gods or devas. The word Mazda means wise. There's other divinities worshipped in Zoroastrianism, but they're often interpreted as aspects of the one god, Ahura Mazda. So one of Zarathustra's innovations as a prophet was advocating that there's only one supreme god that should be worshipped. The Amesha Spantas, or beneficent immortals, are 6 aspects or emanations of Ahura Mazda: good thinking, highest truth, dominion, prosperity, humility, and immortality. And they can also be worshipped as divine beings. So the idea of cosmic dualism in Zoroastrianism is a perpetual conflict between good and evil. On one side is Asha, or truth, which is beneficent, Spenta, and life-giving. On the other side is Druj, or the lie, which is maleficent, Angra, and life-denying. Spenta Mainyu is another name for the good spirit, and he's opposed by Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit. The symbol in this slide is often used to represent either the soul in Zoroastrianism, but it's similar to symbols that could represent the supreme god, or Ahura Mazda in the case of Zoroastrianism. It's a winged solar disk. So a bit more about some of the spirits of Zoroastrianism. In addition to the main two gods, you could say, the good god and the evil spirit, there are yazatas, or various beings worthy of worship. These are the beings praised in the yashts of the Younger Avestan Yasna. They include gods of non-Zoroastrian Iran, but they're basically demoted to lesser beings below Ahura Mazda in status. Mithra is one of the yazatas. He was a god of contracts and covenants. He was the one who became Mithras in Roman religion. And Anahita is a Yazata who's a goddess. You can see a depiction of her on an ancient Persian vessel from the Sasanian dynasty. So the Zoroastrian view of humans is that they have free will to choose whether they will serve the good god Ahura Mazda or the evil spirit Angra Mainyu. Righteous humans are called Ashavans, or possessors of the truth. And of course, the view of Zoroaster is that humans should choose good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Humans should also participate in sacrifices for Ahura Mazda. And there's a view that dishonesty and debt lead to ruin. They will make a person more susceptible to deceit, violence, and eventually a loss of free will. So the religion of the Achaemenid dynasty appears to have been Zoroastrian, although Zarathustra is never mentioned in any of their inscriptions or other sources, but they had very similar beliefs. They worshipped Ahura Mazda. So our sources for the religion of this time are ancient Persian royal inscriptions, the writings of Greek travelers to Persia, and also texts from Babylon and Elam, which were part of the Achaemenid Empire. So there were different types of priests. There were priests conducting ceremonies honoring various gods, Iranian, Elamite, and Babylonian. So the Achaemenid emperors basically supported religions from those various cultures. A lot of ancient kings would do this to try to like cover all their bases and also to help please their various subject populations. But there were also the Magush or Magi, which were priests from Media or western Iran. That was the land of the Medes, basically another Iranic or Persian people. The inscriptions of Darius, who was ruler of the Achaemenids from 522 to 486 BC, use wording similar to that of the younger Avestan scriptures. And so they seem connected to Zoroastrianism. They praise Ahura Mazda as a guarantor of victory in battle. And Ahura Mazda is described as an all-great god who established the cosmos. And Darius portrays himself as an agent of Ahura Mazda, divinely appointed to rule in the world. He also spurns evil gods, maintains order, and promotes prosperity and happiness. So he thinks of himself as having a kind of divine sanction or right to rule. In the picture is a image of a sphinx or a Lamassu-like creature. Lamassu was a type of Mesopotamian mythological being, and the way they're depicted as combining the features of animals, including birds and humans, is similar to the way cherubim and some beings are described in the Hebrew Bible. But they're kind of like divine guardian figures. So part of Achaemenid religion was sacrifices, but they did not practice animal sacrifice, only sacrifices of grain, beer, wine, or fruit. And the lawn sacrifice in particular is performed by the king in honor of Ahura Mazda. So a bit more about the Magi or Magush. These were a tribe of priests from Media in western Iran. And there were different titles given to them. Lawn Lirira, conductor of the lawn sacrifice, Fra Mazda, or outstanding memorizer, and Atravaksha, he who lets the fire grow. The latter two titles connect them to Zoroastrianism because the Zoroastrian priests would memorize hymns and other texts, and they were also connected to fire altars where the sacred fire would be maintained. Later Persian priests were also apparently divided into two types, those who offer libations and those who tend the sacred fire. Depicted is an ancient Zoroastrian priest or magus. It's where we get the word magic from, incidentally, basically because the way they were interpreted by Greeks and Romans as knowing special ceremonies that would give them miraculous powers. So some of the Zoroastrian beliefs are in the text called the Vendidad, which means against the demons. This has beliefs about the nature of the soul, or Urvan, which means breath soul. So it was an individual soul, and it survived the death of the body. It would hover around the deceased body for 3 days and then proceed to the account keeper's bridge, where it would be guided to one of two destinies. Righteous souls would be guided to the house of good thought by a beautiful, sweet-smelling maiden, while evil souls would be led to the house of lies by a foul-smelling hag. There was also a Zoroastrian belief in a kind of cosmic history. So the beginning was an age of creation when all was perfect. The creation was by Ahura Mazda. But then corruption entered the world in the age of debasement. And eventually it came into conflict with Ahura Mazda, leading to the age of conflict, the current age where good and evil are about equally balanced and compete throughout the world. Our age is going to be succeeded by an age of separation, when the good and the evil will be separated once more. Good thought will defeat evil thought, the evil will be cast into oblivion, there'll be a general bodily resurrection of the dead, and the good will spend eternity in heaven. So here is another image of that winged solar disk with the person in the center. This is called the Far Bahar in Zoroastrianism. And it probably was used as a symbol of Ahura Mazda in antiquity, but nowadays it's often interpreted as a symbol of the individual soul. So here's a summary of a few important Zoroastrian practices. Zoroastrians perform morning prayers to the sun or fire, which is a symbolic daily recreation of the world of light from darkness. There's also a recitation of the yasnas at particular hours during the day. The yashts, meanwhile, are performed at seasonal festivals. The most important, or one of the most important Zoroastrian ceremonies is the Naviote, or coming of age ritual. This was traditionally performed at or before age 15. The belief is that a young person's deeds go into their own account and not their parents after they perform this ceremony. So the young person will don a white shirt, which symbolizes the sky lit by the sun, or good thought. And another very important element of the ritual is the kushti, or sacred waistband, that is placed onto the initiate. It's made of 72 threads of white lamb's wool, which symbolize the 72 chapters of the yasna, and 6 tassels, which symbolize the 6 seasonal festivals. You can see in the picture a modern Zoroastrian Naviote ritual. So Zoroastrianism goes back to ancient Persia, and it mostly died out after the Muslim conquest, but there are still some Zoroastrians today, both in the modern nation of Iran, and some of them moved to the city of Bombay or Mumbai in India, where they're known as Parsis. So a bit of later Persian history and the destiny of Zoroastrianism. The Parthian Empire, which ruled from 247 BC to 224 AD, continued the worship of Ahura Mazda by the rulers, but their subjects continued to worship various gods, so they didn't persecute other religions. The Sasanian Empire, which lasted from 224 to 651 AD, did involve persecution of other religions during part of its reign. The king Ardashir I was descended from Zoroastrian priests who attended the sacred fire. Later, Kartir, the high priest under 4 successive kings, is the one who organized the persecution of non-Zoroastrians. He started with the Manichaeans, which we'll describe next, and then proceeded to persecute Jews, Christians, and Buddhists. So if he had been allowed to continue in this process, Zoroastrianism may have been a kind of unifying religion of the Persian Empire, similar to how Christianity became for the Roman Empire to the west. But it was not to be because the Sasanians were conquered by Arab Muslim armies in 651 AD and incorporated into the early Muslim Empire or Caliphate. The Muslims persecuted Zoroastrianism, so it went into decline. Most Persians converted to Islam. There are, as I mentioned in the previous slide, still some descendants of Zoroastrians who fled Persia to India and Bombay, and they're known as Parsis or Persians. Only about 150,000 of them remain, and there's also a small number of Zoroastrians still in Iran. Section 2.9, Manichaeanism. Manichaeanism was an ancient religion that's mostly died out, but it was founded by a prophet from Iran named Mani. He was from a town called Ctesiphon in southern Mesopotamia. So this was a part of Mesopotamia, but at that point it was part of the Persian Empire, and he was of Iranian ancestry. He was raised as an Elkezite, which was an ancient Jewish Christian sect that had Gnostic elements. In other words, these were Christians who believed that Jesus is the Messiah, but they also kept up all the traditional Jewish customs, unlike many other Christians, and they had certain beliefs of secret knowledge, secret teachings. But Mani did not stay in this sect. He had his own mystic revelations or epiphanies at the age of 12 and at the age of 24. So he claimed that this living God revealed to him the true origins and future of the universe, which he called the mystery of light and darkness. So Manichaeanism was a dualistic religion like Zoroastrianism, but it had many other distinctive beliefs. So early in his life, he traveled eastward to the Indus River Valley and learned about Hinduism and Buddhism. He returned to Ctesiphon later and is reputed to have performed many miracles. So he gained the support, or at least the protection, of the early Sasanian kings, who were Zoroastrian rather, but they also gave some support to Mani. So he was able to preach in Iran and Mesopotamia. He gained many followers, and he created a sacred canon of written texts. Some of them were supplemented with pictures so that even the illiterate could learn about the religion from these scriptures. So he also talked about the mystery of the apostles, which was that previous prophets, among which he numbered the Buddha from India, Zoroaster from Persia, and Jesus from Israel, were all authoritative prophets for their time, inspired by the same living God. But they were not sufficient for the present. So he portrayed himself as a later day prophet, which added to and summarized and kind of completed the teachings of these earlier prophets. So he eventually died because he was persecuted by the Zoroastrian priest Kartir. Kartir prodded the Persian king Bahram I to arrest and ultimately execute Mani in 276 AD. So some of the main beliefs of Manichaeanism were dualism. Creation had produced two opposed and co-eternal principles which were at war with each other. God, or the Father of goodness, was the source of good, peace, justice, and wisdom, and he resides in the world of light. Satan, or matter, was evil, inhabited darkness, and had invaded the realm of light and thus imprisoned or trapped some light within the matter. And that's basically what we are. We're beings of light, but we're trapped in material bodies, and so we have to liberate ourselves. God tasks individual humans, including Mani and some of his elect followers, to liberate the light from the matter. Eventually, a cosmic conflagration or cosmic fire will consume the entire universe, and light and darkness will again exist separately. In the picture is a worship of the Tree of Life, which was believed to be in the world of God, or the world of light. So there were many distinctive practices of Zoroastrianism. A lot of them were connected around the elect. These are basically the Zoroastrian clergy, who were male and female ascetics, so they had to renounce everything worldly. They followed 5 commandments and 3 seals. They prayed 7 times a day, and they fasted 100 days per year. The 5 commandments for the elect were no lying, no killing, no eating meat, no sexual intercourse, and no personal possessions. These are similar to the 5 vows of Jainism and Buddhism. So this may represent influence of Indian religions on the preaching of Mani. The 3 seals were the seal of the mouth, seal of the hand, and the seal of thought. The seal of the mouth meant vigilance over thoughts and expressions, and also avoiding eating prohibited foods, which include wine and meat. So the elect practiced vegetarianism. The seal of the hands indicates the vigilance over action, including especially no killing of any living creature, even animals. And the seal of thought consisted of the desire to seek harmony with the world of light. Bema was the main feast day of Manichaeanism, and it was named for the throne on which Mani's portrait was placed on this anniversary of his death, which is what the festival celebrated. And then everyone else who was a Manichaean was called a hearer or auditor. So these were lay persons who heard the teaching from the elect, but they didn't follow the same ascetic lifestyle. So the hearers still had rules to follow. They were forbidden from lying, murdering, robbing, or committing adultery, but they were allowed to own property, perform labor, and kill plants for food. They were supposed to pray 4 times a day and fast 50 times per year. This is a picture of Mani establishing his community of elect followers. And you'll notice it's from a kind of Central Asian or East Asian style. It's similar to Chinese depictions of Buddhist themes around the same time. When Manichaeanism spread to the East, to Central Asia and China, the Manichaean art was using similar imagery to that of Buddhist art from the period. And it's not entirely coincidence. Not only was that just the native artistic tradition, but Mani himself had combined some ideas from Buddhism, like the teaching that the Buddha was one of the previous prophets in his lineage. So Manichaeanism spread both to the west and to the east. Mani didn't really travel outside the Persian Empire, but some of his disciples spread the religion east to India and west to Egypt. It eventually spread even further west. for example, to North Africa, Italy, and other parts of the Roman Empire. The Emperor Diocletian persecuted Manichaeanism prior to his persecution of Christianity, but the religion spread west across the Mediterranean. There were 5 Christian bishops of the Roman province of Africa that were former Manichaeans, including St. Augustine. So it's an indication of just how prominent and popular the religion was in the Roman West at one time. Eventually, Augustine became one of the most staunch critics of Manichaeanism, however. Faustus was a Manichaean apologist in the West. He argued that Jews and Christians were heirs of paganism, still practicing some quasi-pagan festivals and rituals, whereas Manichaeans were actually the true followers of Jesus. Manichaeanism also spread east along the Silk Road to Central Asia and China. It became the state religion of the Uyghur kings from 763 to 840 AD. The Uyghurs were a Central Asian people who are still around today in what's now Xinjiang in China. And Manichaeanism was called the religion of light in China. Eventually, Manichaeanism fell into decline and almost entirely died out. Its decline in the West was a function of Constantine and later Christian emperors condemning it as a heresy or just a false religion. And Augustine and other important fathers of the church also criticized Manichaean dualism. The Christian belief, in brief, is that matter is not all or essentially evil. It's actually part of God's creation. So they didn't think of it as just the work of this evil God. Manichaeanism disappeared in the West by the 6th century AD as the West became increasingly Christian. In the East, it was persecuted by the Sasanian dynasty in Persia. And later, with the conquest of Islam, the Umayyad Caliphate defeated the Sasanians. Manichaeans initially returned to Persia from their exile after having fled the Sasanian persecution, but they were swiftly attacked by the succeeding Abbasid Caliphate, which succeeded the Umayyads. And ever since the Abbasids, Manichaeanism and other Persian religions just declined into almost non-existence in Iran. So they fled east to Central Asia and China, where they prospered for a while. But later on, there were sporadic persecutions of the religion in China. And it forced the remaining Manichaeans to operate in secret. They often claimed to be Taoists or Buddhists. So there's one temple still in China, Temple of Cao An, which has this icon of the Buddha of Light. It's actually a depiction of Mani. So it's kind of like a Buddhist or Taoist temple that's kind of surviving this worship of Mani. But practically speaking, Manichaeanism doesn't survive as like a strong sect or tradition in China anymore. Section 2.10, the end of paganism. Paganism, or the pre-Christian religions of antiquity, ended in the Roman Empire through the spread of Christianity. Theodosius I was a Christian Roman emperor who outlawed all of the ancient Greek oracles and their associated festivals. And Justinian I was an Eastern Roman emperor who closed the pagan Greek philosophical schools in 529 AD. That largely contributed to the end of ancient Greek philosophy, but the philosophical schools were some of the last enclaves of Neoplatonism, theurgy, and kind of like the ancient Greek religious cultural tradition in general. So that's it for our summary of ancient religions in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Next up, we're going to do Chapter 3, Judaism. Until next time.